Here's what mainstream archaeology doesn't want you to know. Beneath the waters of the Great Flood lie entire civilizations that the Bible never mentioned. Cities with advanced technologies, mysterious temples, and secrets that could rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient history. For centuries, religious texts have told us about Noah's Ark and the 40 days of rain, but they've remained silent about something far more extraordinary: the lost cities that vanished beneath the waves, taking with them knowledge that was meant to be forgotten. Today, we're diving deep into the forbidden archaeology and suppressed discoveries that reveal the true scope of the flood and why certain powers have worked so hard to keep these findings buried. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you find this type of content valuable. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? Picture a morning when the sky held no warning. Markets filled with voices, children laughed in narrow streets, and merchants counted coins that would never buy tomorrow. The air smelled of fresh bread and distant rain. Then came the trembling. Not the gentle shake of passing carts, but something deeper. Something that made the stones themselves cry out. Windows rattled in their frames, dogs began to howl, birds took flight in great black clouds, abandoning their nests as if they knew what humans had forgotten. The first drops fell like tears from a broken heaven, large drops that splashed against dusty roads, turning earth to mud in moments. People looked up, puzzled. Rain was common enough. But this rain carried something different, something final. In the distance, a sound grew. Not thunder, though it rumbled like the voice of sleeping giants. Not wind, though it rushed with the fury of 1,000 storms. Water, an ocean of water, moving where no ocean should be. Children stopped their games. Mothers called their little ones close. Fathers stared at the horizon where a wall of blue-green death approached their world. Some prayed, others ran. Most simply stood and watched the impossible unfold. The water came with the patience of eternity and the speed of lightning. It swallowed fields first, then roads, then the lower districts where the poor had built their simple homes. Screams echoed off stone walls as people climbed higher, always higher, seeking safety that would not come. Ancient pillars that had stood for generations cracked and fell. Temples devoted to forgotten gods collapsed into the rising tide. Libraries filled with knowledge turned to pulp in moments. Art that had taken lifetimes to create vanished beneath the waves. Children cried for parents swept away. Parents reached for children they would never hold again. Love letters dissolved in pockets. Wedding rings slipped from dying fingers. Dreams ended in salt water and silence. The great cedar doors of palaces burst inward. Kings and beggars died the same death, drowning in democracy's cruelest form. Gold meant nothing. Titles meant nothing. Only breath mattered, and breath was running out. Rooftops became islands, then graves. The highest towers stood like fingers pointing at an unforgiving sky until they too surrendered to the endless water. Streets became rivers, rivers became seas, and seas became everything. In those final moments, as the last air bubbles rose from the last drowning city, what knowledge died with them? What songs would never be sung again? What inventions were lost forever? What stories of love and loss and human triumph simply ended? The water settled into stillness. No more screams, no more prayers, only silence stretching across a world remade. Somewhere above, rain continued to fall as if the heavens wept for what they had destroyed. But why? What had these people done to deserve such complete annihilation? What sins had they committed that demanded not just death, but erasure? What truths were so dangerous that they had to be washed from the world entirely? The water keeps its secrets. It always has. But sometimes, when the tide is low and the moon is bright, you can almost hear whispers rising from the deep, echoes of the last words spoken in the last moments of the world that was. What did we lose when those cities died? And more troubling still, what if their destruction was not the end of their story, but the beginning of ours? The myth in the mirror. Every culture remembers drowning. Not personal drowning, but world drowning. The kind that ends everything and begins everything anew. This memory lives in our bones, passed down through generations like an ancient fever that never quite breaks. In Mesopotamia, where writing first bloomed, clay tablets tell of Utnapishtim and his great boat. The gods grew tired of human noise, they said. Our cities were too loud, our lives too messy, so they sent water to quiet us forever. Far away in the sacred texts of India, Manu received a warning from a tiny fish. The fish grew larger each day until it became Vishnu himself, divine and terrible. He told Manu to build a boat to save the seeds of life, to prepare for the water that would wash the world clean. Ancient China speaks of Gunyu and the great floods that covered mountains. Water rose until the highest peaks became islands. Dragons ruled the waves while humans prayed for dry land that might never come again. Across the vast ocean, Maya scribes carved glyphs telling how the gods destroyed the world 3 times, once by jaguars, once by wind, and once by rain that fell for 52 years without stopping. The fourth world, our world, trembles with the knowledge that it too will end. The Hopi remember 7 worlds, each destroyed as the previous one grew wicked. They speak of ant people who saved the righteous underground while water covered the surface. Their prophecies warn that the 8th world's destruction has already begun. In Greece, Deucalion built his ark when Zeus decided humanity had grown too proud. Only 2 survived to throw stones over their shoulders, stones that became new people. The old people, the first people, drowned for their hubris. Norse sagas tell of Ragnarok, when Jormungandr, the world serpent, will rise from the ocean and flood Midgard. Even the gods will drown in this final winter. Only 2 humans will survive, hidden in Yggdrasil's trunk, to birth the world that comes after. Aboriginal Australians sing of the rainbow serpent's great flood, when greed and broken laws angered the earth itself. Water rose from sacred sites, swallowing camps and people, leaving only high places and hard lessons. The Lakota speak of destruction by flood when people forgot how to live in harmony. Water covered everything except one high hill, where the wise ones waited for the earth to remember how to breathe again. Even in Africa, the Mandinka tell how Pharaoh, the river god, grew angry at human cruelty and sent waters to drown the world. A few escaped in boats, carrying seeds and memories to plant in the mud when the waters receded. These stories share strange details, a warning that goes unheeded, a righteous few who survive, animals saved in pairs or groups, a boat or mountain refuge, a rainbow or dove announcing the end, new life sprouting from the wreckage of the old. But here's what makes you pause in the quiet hours before dawn. These cultures had no contact with each other when these stories were born. No internet, no books, no travelers carrying tales across oceans. Yet they all remember the same drowning. They all carry the same wound. Were these stories inspired by local floods, rivers overflowing their banks, tsunamis swallowing coastal towns, storm surges that seemed like the world's end? Perhaps. Local disasters can feel universal when you're living through them. Or do these myths point to something else? A memory so deep it transcends culture and geography? A real event so catastrophic it echoed through every human lineage, growing into legend but never quite losing its truth? Scientists speak of ice ages ending, of glacial dams bursting, of sea levels rising hundreds of feet as the world warmed. They describe mega floods that dwarfed anything in recorded history, waters that could indeed have seemed like the world's end to those who witnessed them. But the myths suggest something more deliberate than climate change. They speak of judgment, of moral failing, of gods who grew tired of human behavior and decided to start over. They hint at lost civilizations, advanced knowledge, and technologies that had to be destroyed for reasons we no longer understand. What if these floods were not random disasters, but reset buttons? What if someone or something periodically decides that humanity has learned too much, grown too powerful, become too dangerous? What if drowning the world is how we're kept in check? The myths mirror each other across time and space, reflecting truths too deep for words. They whisper of cycles within cycles, of rises and falls, of knowledge gained and lost and gained again. They remind us that we are not the first to believe we are the first. In the quiet spaces between these ancient voices, a question grows. What if the myths are not myths at all, but memories? And if they are memories, what are they trying to help us remember? Genesis and the forgotten lines. The Bible tells the flood story in careful, measured words. Rain fell for 40 days. Waters covered the earth for 150 days. Noah built an ark and saved his family and the animals. God made a rainbow covenant, promising never to flood the world again. Simple, clean, complete. But between the lines and the spaces where scribes chose silence over speech, other stories whisper. Older stories, stranger stories, stories that make the official version seem like a children's book compared to the original manuscript. Genesis mentions the Nephilim in passing as if you already know who they are. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man and they bore children to them. 12 words that hint at cosmic drama, then move on to genealogies and lifespans. Who were these sons of God? The text assumes you know. It assumes you understand why their children were called Nephilim, which means fallen ones. It assumes you grasp why this detail matters enough to mention, but not enough to explain. Early Hebrew cosmology painted a universe of 3 levels. Heaven above, where God dwelled in unapproachable light. Earth in the middle, where humans lived and died and dreamed. The deep below, where waters waited to reclaim the dry land that God had separated from them in the beginning. But between heaven and earth, the watchers kept their vigil. Angels assigned to observe humanity, to report back to the throne about how the experiment was progressing. They were meant to watch, not participate, to guard, not interfere, to remain holy, separate, pure. The Book of Enoch, treasured by early Christians but later removed from most Bibles, tells what the watchers saw that made them forget their purpose. Human women, beautiful beyond their ability to resist. Love, or something that felt like love, blooming in hearts that had known only duty. 200 watchers descended to Mount Hermon. They took human wives and taught them secrets that heaven had not intended to share. Metallurgy and cosmetics, warfare and astrology, medicine and magic. Knowledge that transformed simple farming communities into something approaching civilization. Their children grew into giants. Not just tall, but mighty. Not just strong, but strange. The Nephilim inherited their father's knowledge and their mother's mortality, creating a hybrid race that belonged fully to neither world. These giants built cities that touched the sky. They forged weapons that could split mountains. They mapped the stars and named the seasons. They created wonders that made the angels in heaven grow nervous and the humans on earth grow proud. But knowledge without wisdom is poison. Power without restraint is destruction. The Nephilim used their gifts to dominate rather than serve, to take rather than give, to corrupt rather than elevate. They turned their fathers' secrets into tools of oppression. The earth itself began to groan, not metaphorically, but literally. The weight of their sins pressed down on creation like a stone on a flower. Blood cried out from the ground. The sun seemed dimmer. The moon appeared to weep. God looked down and saw that every intention of the human heart was only evil continually. Not some intentions, not most intentions, every intention. The corruption was complete, spreading like infection through the bloodline of Adam until no pure strain remained, except for Noah. The text calls him perfect in his generations, a phrase that sounds like genealogical purity rather than moral excellence. Perhaps Noah's bloodline remained uncontaminated by Nephilim heritage. Perhaps his family carried the original human DNA that God had breathed into Adam's clay. The flood was not random divine anger. It was surgical cosmic cleansing. The water that covered the earth was not meant to punish the innocent, but to preserve them. To wash away the hybrid contamination that threatened to make humans into something they were never meant to be. But the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The flood did not end their story. Somehow, some way, the giant bloodline survived. Canaan's descendants included Anakim and Rephaim, tribes of giants that made Israelite spies feel like grasshoppers. How did they survive? Did some Nephilim escape to high places the water could not reach? Did they hide in caves or boats of their own? Did the corruption reemerge from recessive genes in Noah's family? Or did new watchers descend after the flood to begin the cycle again? The official story skips these questions. It moves quickly from flood to rainbow, from judgment to promise, from cosmic crisis to family drama. But the questions linger in footnotes and margins, in apocryphal texts and ancient traditions. What if the flood was not the end of the first world, but the beginning of a cover-up? What if the Bible we have is an edited version, with the most disturbing chapters removed? What if the real story is too wild, too dangerous, too paradigm-shattering to tell? In synagogues and churches, children learn about Noah's obedience and God's mercy. They color pictures of giraffes poking their heads out of the ark and rainbows stretching across blue skies, sweet stories for innocent ears. But late at night, when the sanctuary is empty and silence fills the spaces between prayers, older stories stir, stories of gods who walked among humans, stories of knowledge too powerful for mortal minds, stories of floods that were not endings but beginnings, stories that were written then hidden, told, remembered, then forgotten, stories that refuse to stay buried. The world before the deluge. Imagine cities where every building reached toward heaven, their towers piercing clouds that had never known rain. Streets paved with stones that glowed in the darkness, lit by knowledge that made fire seem primitive. Gardens where plants grew twice their natural size, fed by techniques that made barren ground bloom like paradise. This was the antediluvian world, the civilization that existed before the flood. Not the simple farming communities of our imaginations, but a society that might have made our modern age seem quaint by comparison. The Book of Enoch describes cities built by the Watchers and their giant children, structures that defied gravity, constructed with mathematics that human minds had not yet evolved to understand. Architecture that incorporated cosmic principles, aligning with stars and seasons in ways that channeled Earth's hidden energies. These builders did not simply stack stones. They grew their buildings from living rock, coaxing crystal formations into walls and pillars. They wove metal-like fabric, creating alloys that never rusted or broke. They captured sunlight and prisms that stored the day's energy for the night's illumination. In these cities, the Nephilim ruled as priest-kings. Half divine, half human, they possessed lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades, time enough to master every art, to push every boundary, to explore every frontier of possibility. They mapped the heavens with precision that would not be matched again until the age of satellites. They understood the Earth's magnetic fields, using them to navigate oceans and continents with impossible accuracy. They domesticated not just animals, but weather patterns, calling rain when they needed it and banishing storms that threatened their crops. Their medicine could heal wounds that should have been fatal, extend lives that should have been brief. They knew the secret names of diseases, the hidden weaknesses of death itself. Some whispered that they had learned to cheat mortality entirely, transferring consciousness from worn-out bodies into new ones. But their greatest achievement was knowledge itself. They built libraries that contained every secret worth knowing, crystalline matrices that stored information in patterns of light and sound, archives that preserved not just words and pictures, but experiences and emotions, memories and dreams. In these repositories, you could learn the true names of angels, the hidden properties of minerals, the secret history of creation itself. You could study the languages that plants speak to each other, the songs that stars sing in the darkness, the mathematics that governs love and loss and longing. Yet with all their power, they grew restless. Knowledge without limits breeds hunger without satisfaction. They began to probe boundaries that were meant to remain unbroken. They experimented with life itself, creating hybrid beings that violated the natural order. Some texts speak of chimeras, creatures combining human intelligence with animal strength. Others describe attempts to breed new races, mixing bloodlines in ways that produced monsters rather than marvels. The Watchers' children inherited their father's curiosity but not their wisdom, their power but not their restraint. Trade routes connected these cities across vast distances. Merchants carried not just goods but ideas and innovations, spreading techniques that transformed entire regions. Coastal cities sent ships across oceans that modern explorers would not dare to cross. Mountain settlements exchanged raw materials for finished products that bordered on the miraculous. Art flourished beyond anything our museums could contain. Sculptures that moved and danced, paintings that changed with the viewer's mood, music that could heal the sick or drive listeners to ecstasy. Beauty became a weapon, wonder became a drug, creativity became a form of magic. But beneath the splendor, corruption grew like mold in paradise. The powerful exploited the weak with technologies that made resistance impossible. Surveillance systems that watched every action, thought-reading devices that monitored every private moment, weapons that could kill from continents away. The Nephilim established castes based on bloodline purity. Those with more angelic heritage ruled over those with less. Humans without giant ancestry became servants, then slaves, then subjects for experimentation. Freedom became a forgotten concept, dignity a discarded ideal. Their cities became centers of vice that would make Sodom and Gomorrah seem restrained. Technologies of pleasure that addicted their users, entertainments that corrupted the soul, practices that violated every natural law. They created artificial paradises that were actually sophisticated hells. Violence escalated beyond anything history had recorded. Wars fought with weapons that could reshape continents, battles that left scars the earth still carries. They learned to wound not just bodies but souls themselves, inflicting damage that persisted beyond death. Worst of all, they began to believe their own propaganda. Their power convinced them that they were gods, their knowledge that they were wise, their achievements that they were immortal. They forgot that they were creatures, not creators. They ignored the fact that they were guests on earth, not owners. The earth itself grew sick from their excesses. The air thickened with pollutants that made breathing difficult. The water became poisoned with chemicals that caused birth defects and madness. The soil grew barren from techniques that increased yield in the short term, but destroyed fertility forever. Animals fled from human settlements, sensing corruption that the people themselves had grown numb to. Birds stopped singing near the great cities. Fish died in rivers that had run clear for millennia. Even insects began to avoid places where humans gathered. Then the rains began. Not the gentle showers that nourished crops, but the angry downpours that announced judgment. The watchers who had descended to earth were called back to heaven for trial. Their children, the Nephilim, were left behind to face consequences they had never imagined possible. The great libraries were sealed. The flying machines were grounded. The weapons of mass destruction were turned against their creators. The cities that had reached toward heaven were pulled down into the depths. Everything they had built, everything they had discovered, everything they had achieved washed away in 40 days and 40 nights of rain that fell like tears from a broken heart. But questions remain in the silence after the flood. How much knowledge was lost? How many innovations disappeared forever? How much human potential was drowned along with human corruption? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what if some of it survived? Enoch's forbidden knowledge. Before the flood, when giants walked the earth and angels forgot their place, one man walked with God in ways that defied explanation. Enoch, seventh from Adam, lived 365 years before God took him without tasting death. The Bible mentions him briefly, almost casually, as if everyone already knew his extraordinary story. But Enoch left behind a book, a massive, complex work that early Christians treasured and later church authorities buried. The book of Enoch tells the story behind the story, the forbidden history that explains why the flood became necessary. According to Enoch's visions, 200 watchers descended to Mount Hermon in the days of Jared. Their leader, Semjaza, convinced them to take human wives despite knowing this violated cosmic law. They swore an oath together, binding themselves to rebellion, sharing the guilt so that none could turn back. Each watcher taught humanity different secrets. Azazel revealed metallurgy, showing humans how to make swords and shields, mirrors and jewelry. Barakel taught astrology, mapping the movements of stars and planets. Kokarel showed the signs of the earth, revealing hidden meanings in natural phenomena. Ezekiel taught cloud knowledge, explaining weather patterns and storm systems. Arakiel revealed Earth's signs, the secret language of geology and geography. Shamsiel shared the signs of the sun, the hidden messages in light and shadow. Each lesson pushed humanity further from innocence toward dangerous sophistication. The humans learned quickly, perhaps too quickly. They discovered how to work gold and silver, creating ornaments that sparked envy and greed. They mastered iron and copper, forging weapons that made war more deadly. They understood antimony and lead, developing cosmetics that enhanced beauty but corrupted the soul. Astronomy became astrology, knowledge twisted into fortune-telling and fate manipulation. Medicine became magic, healing arts perverted into curses and poisons. Mathematics became mystery religion, numbers invested with supernatural power. The Watchers' children, the Nephilim, inherited both knowledge and corruption. They grew into giants, not just of body, but of appetite. They consumed everything in their path: food, resources, people. When animals could not satisfy their hunger, they began eating humans. When humans resisted, they began eating each other. Enoch witnessed their violence with his own eyes. He saw them establish cities where human sacrifice became entertainment, where torture became art, where corruption became culture. They, they created technologies of oppression that made resistance impossible and escape unthinkable. But knowledge itself was not evil. The same metallurgy that made swords also made plows. The same astronomy that enabled fortune-telling also guided navigation. The same mathematics that powered mystery cults also built better houses and bridges. The problem was timing. Humanity received advanced knowledge without developing the wisdom to use it responsibly. They gained power over nature without learning to govern themselves. They discovered cosmic secrets while remaining spiritual children. Enoch's role was to witness and record. God took him on tours of creation, showing him the machinery behind reality. He saw the storehouses where snow and hail waited for their appointed times. He visited the chambers where winds were sorted and stored. He learned the names of every star and the purpose of every constellation. He saw the prison where fallen angels awaited final judgment. He witnessed the torture chambers where watchers paid for their rebellion. He observed the cosmic courtroom where sentences were pronounced on rebels against divine order. Most importantly, he saw the future. God showed him the flood that would cleanse the earth, the rainbow that would seal the promise, the ages that would follow until the final judgment. He learned that history moves in cycles, that what has happened will happen again, that knowledge lost will always be recovered. Enoch's book contains detailed astronomical calculations, geographic descriptions, and scientific observations that should have been impossible for ancient writers to know. It describes the Earth as round, explains the cause of seasons, predicts eclipses with mathematical precision. It also contains prophecies that extend far beyond the flood. Enoch saw the coming of a Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, the final battle between good and evil. He witnessed the new heaven and new earth that would replace the current creation. But his most disturbing vision concerned the survival of forbidden knowledge. He saw that some secrets would be preserved through the flood, hidden in safe places or carried in the memories of survivors. He prophesied that the same corruption that caused the first judgment would eventually return. Early Christians believed Enoch's book was genuine prophecy, quoting it frequently and treating it as scripture. The Epistle of Jude quotes Enoch directly, calling him a prophet and validating his visions. Church fathers like Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria referenced his teachings regularly. Then something changed. By the 4th century, church authorities began questioning Enoch's authenticity. They argued that his scientific knowledge was too advanced, his prophecies too detailed, his cosmology too complex for a simple antediluvian patriarch. The Book of Enoch was gradually removed from biblical canons, excluded from public readings, hidden in monastery libraries. Copies became rare, then extinct, surviving only in Ethiopia, where the church maintained different standards. Why was Enoch suppressed? Perhaps his visions were too disturbing, his prophecies too specific, his warnings too clear. Perhaps church leaders feared that knowledge of the Watchers would inspire new rebellions, that understanding of forbidden secrets would corrupt their flocks. Or perhaps they recognized something more troubling. Perhaps they saw connections between Enoch's ancient warnings and their contemporary world. Perhaps they noticed similarities between the Watchers' gifts and their own era's innovations. What if Enoch's book was not suppressed to protect people from ancient superstitions, but to prevent them from recognizing modern realities? What if the forbidden knowledge never really disappeared, but simply changed forms? What if the Watchers' rebellion continues in new disguises? In our age of genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, of global surveillance and weather modification, of space exploration and consciousness research, Enoch's warnings take on new relevance. His descriptions of antediluvian technology sound less like fantasy and more like prophecy. The book that early Christians treasured and later authorities buried may be the key to understanding not just the ancient flood, but the modern world. The forbidden knowledge that the Watchers taught may be the same knowledge that drives our current civilization toward its own moment of judgment. Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him. But his book remains, hidden in plain sight, waiting for eyes that can see and hearts that can understand. Waiting for a generation that can handle the truth about what was lost in the flood, what survived the waters, and what threatens to bring the waters back. Mesopotamia's flooded kings. Deep in the ruins of ancient Sumer, archaeologists found clay tablets that shattered comfortable assumptions about human history. Written in cuneiform script that took decades to decode, these documents contained lists of kings who ruled before the Great Flood. Not ordinary kings with normal lifespans, but monarchs who reigned for thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years. The Sumerian king list begins with a simple statement that changed everything. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship's in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. 28,800 years for a single reign. In a world where human lifespans rarely exceeded 40 years, these numbers seemed impossible. Scholars dismissed them as mythology, religious exaggeration, primitive attempts to aggrandize ancient rulers. But the tablets were serious historical documents, carefully maintained in royal archives. Scribes who recorded ordinary business transactions with meticulous accuracy compiled these king lists with the same attention to detail. They clearly believed these numbers were factual records, not mythological embellishments. Alulim's successor, Alamgar, ruled for 36,000 years. The third king, Enmenluana, reigned for 43,200 years. King after king with lifespans that dwarfed anything in recorded history, ruling a world that bore little resemblance to the Mesopotamia that followed the flood. These antediluvian kings possessed abilities that bordered on the supernatural. They communed directly with gods, receiving knowledge and instructions from divine sources. They understood sciences that later generations would struggle to rediscover. They built cities using techniques that modern engineers cannot fully explain. Enmeduranki, the seventh king of Sippar, holds special significance. According to later traditions, he was taken up to heaven by the gods Shamash and Adadad, who revealed to him the secrets of divination, astronomy, and mathematics. When he returned to Earth, he established the guild of priests who would preserve these mysteries for future generations. The parallels to Enoch are unmistakable. Both were seventh in their lineages. Both were taken up by divine beings. Both received knowledge that they transmitted to their descendants. Both became bridges between the heavenly and earthly realms. The last king before the flood, Ubartudu, ruled from the city of Shuruppak for 18,600 years. His son, according to some versions of the list, was Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah who survived the deluge in his great boat. The transition from the pre-flood world to the post-flood world happened within a single family, from father to son. Then came the flood. The tablets state it simply. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. But something fundamental had changed. The post-flood kings lived normal human lifespans. The first ruler after the deluge, Gar, reigned for only 1,200 years, practically mortal by pre-flood standards. His successors ruled for centuries rather than millennia, then decades rather than centuries. What caused this dramatic shift? Why did human lifespans suddenly become finite? The king lists offer no explanation, but other texts provide hints. The gods, angered by the corruption of the pre-flood world, limited human lifespans to prevent the same mistakes from recurring. Some scholars suggest that the enormous pre-flood lifespans reflect different methods of calculating time. Perhaps ancient scribes used lunar months instead of solar years, or seasonal cycles instead of annual ones. Mathematical adjustments could make these numbers more reasonable. But such explanations create new problems. Even with the most generous adjustments, the pre-flood kings lived far longer than any human in recorded history. The numbers remain stubbornly supernatural, resistant to rational explanation. Other researchers propose that the king lists preserve memories of a completely different type of being. What if the pre-flood rulers were not human at all, but the Nephilim described in Genesis and Enoch? Hybrid beings with extended lifespans, superior abilities, and direct connections to divine realms? This interpretation makes the flood's purpose clearer. It was not just punishment for human wickedness, but cosmic surgery to remove an alien element from Earth's biosphere. The deluge eliminated the long lived hybrids and restored normal human genetics to the survivors. Archaeological evidence from pre flood Mesopotamian sites reveals sophisticated technologies that seem inconsistent with primitive human societies. Advanced metallurgy, complex mathematics, precise astronomical observations, sophisticated urban planning. The kind of achievements that might be expected from beings with centuries or millennia to perfect their crafts. The city of Uruk, traditionally associated with Gilgamesh, shows evidence of construction techniques that modern engineers struggle to replicate. Massive stone blocks fitted together with impossible precision, drainage systems that still function after thousands of years, foundations that remain stable despite millennia of earthquakes. Similar anomalies appear throughout the pre-flood archaeological record. Tools made from alloys that should not have been possible with ancient technology. Buildings oriented to astronomical alignments that require sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics. Art depicting creatures and scenes that seem to reference advanced scientific concepts. But the most intriguing evidence comes from the king lists themselves. Cross-referencing different tablets from various cities reveals consistent chronologies and overlapping reigns. These were not isolated myths, but coordinated historical records maintained across multiple locations. The scribes who compiled these lists had access to sources that we have lost. They worked from archives that stretched back to the beginning of recorded time, preserving memories that later generations would dismiss as impossibilities. What if they were right? What if there really was a time when godlike beings ruled the earth for thousands of years? What if human civilization is not a linear progression from primitive to advanced, but a cycle of rise and fall, achievement and destruction, memory and forgetting? The Sumerian king list ends with kings whose names we recognize from conventional history, rulers whose lifespans make sense, whose achievements seem human, whose failures reflect familiar limitations. But it begins with beings who seem to belong to another world entirely, a world that ended in flood. A world whose survivors carried forward fragments of knowledge and kingship, but not the power or longevity of their predecessors. A world that left behind monuments and mysteries, but not explanations. The clay tablets that preserve these records continue to crack and crumble in museum storage rooms. Each year, more cuneiform text becomes unreadable. More ancient knowledge fades into dust. We are losing the king lists just as the ancient world lost the kings themselves. But the questions they raise refuse to disappear. Who were these long-lived rulers? What knowledge did they possess? Why did the flood end their reign? And most disturbing of all, what if they left descendants who remember what the rest of us have forgotten? The Epic of Ziusudra. In the beginning, there was Ziusudra. Not Noah, not Utnapishtim, but Ziusudra. The first flood hero, the original survivor whose story would echo through every culture that came after. His tale, preserved on fragments of ancient Sumerian clay, tells the oldest known version of humanity's greatest catastrophe. The tablet opens in the middle of a divine conversation. The gods have grown weary of humanity's noise, their constant chatter that disturbs the heavenly peace. But Enki, god of wisdom and water, disagrees with the decision to destroy all human life. He cannot openly defy the divine council, but he can find clever ways around their decree. Ziusudra served as both king and priest in the city of Shuruppak, a righteous man who offered proper sacrifices and kept divine laws even when others grew corrupt around him. Enki noticed this faithfulness and decided to preserve what deserved preservation. The god spoke to Ziusudra through a reed wall, technically honoring the restriction against direct communication while still delivering the crucial warning. "Tear down your house and build a boat," the voice whispered. "Abandon possessions and seek life. Spurn property and save living beings." The instructions were specific. The boat should be built according to exact measurements, sealed with bitumen to keep out water, provisioned for a long journey. Most importantly, Ziusudra should bring aboard representatives of every living creature: animals, birds, insects, seeds, eggs. Life itself needed sanctuary from the coming destruction. Construction began immediately. Ziusudra's family worked alongside skilled craftsmen, following Enki's detailed blueprints. The boat was enormous, far larger than any vessel previously built for river navigation. Neighbors mocked the project, unable to imagine waters deep enough to require such a massive craft. As the boat neared completion, signs began appearing in earth and sky. Animals fled from their usual habitats, seeking higher ground for reasons they could not explain. Birds abandoned their nests in great flocks, circling restlessly without settling anywhere. The wind carried strange scents. The pressure felt different. The very air seemed to thicken with approaching doom. Then came the moment of loading. Ziusudra gathered his family, his livestock, and representatives of every species he could find. The boat filled with bleating sheep, lowing cattle, chirping birds, and creatures whose names had been lost to time. Seeds went into carefully sealed containers. Tools and knowledge were wrapped in waterproof materials. The final preparations happened in eerie silence. No wind stirred the reeds along the riverbank. No insects buzzed in the heavy air. Even the Euphrates seemed to hold its breath, flowing more slowly than usual toward the distant sea. When the storm began, it came with violence that defied natural explanation. Not rain, but waterfalls pouring from a sky that had torn open like fabric. Thunder that shook the earth's foundations. Lightning that turned night into blazing day, then plunged everything back into absolute darkness. The wind howled with voices that sounded almost human. Screams of terror, cries for mercy, prayers that went unanswered. Trees older than memory were uprooted and flung like twigs. Buildings that had stood for generations collapsed in moments. The very landscape began to dissolve. Ziusudra sealed the boat's final opening just as the waters reached its hull. From inside, he could hear the flood beginning its terrible work. First came the sounds of destruction. Walls cracking, roofs caving in, pottery shattering. Then came the sounds of desperation, people calling for help, children crying for their parents, animals howling in panic. The boat lifted from its moorings and began to drift. Through small windows, Yosudra watched his world disappear beneath an ocean that had no business existing. Fields where grain had grown that morning were underwater by afternoon. Hills that had seemed permanent became temporary islands, then vanished entirely. Day after day, the storm continued. The boat rode waves taller than mountains, driven by winds that seemed to blow from every direction at once. Sometimes they glimpsed other survivors clinging to debris, but the waters were too violent for rescue. One by one, these desperate souls disappeared beneath the surface. Inside the ark, the animals grew restless and afraid. The constant motion made many of them sick. Food supplies dwindled faster than expected. Fresh water became a precious commodity, collected drop by drop from leaks in the roof. Death came for some of the creatures despite every effort to save them. But slowly, gradually, the violence subsided. The thunder grew more distant. The lightning became less frequent. The waves that had threatened to overturn the boat settled into a gentler rhythm. After what seemed like an eternity, something that might have been silence returned to the world. When the rain finally stopped, it stopped completely. The sudden quiet felt almost as overwhelming as the storm's fury had been. No bird songs, no insect hums, no human voices, just the lapping of water against the boat's hull and the creaking of wood adjusting to stillness. Days passed before they dared to open the windows. When they did, an endless ocean stretched to every horizon. No landmarks remained visible. No mountains pierced the surface. The entire world had become water, reflecting an empty sky that gave no clues about location or direction. Ziusudra released a dove, hoping it would find dry land and return with proof that somewhere, somehow, the earth was beginning to emerge from the flood. The bird disappeared into the distance and did not come back. Days later, he sent another dove. This one returned with a fresh olive leaf in its beak, the first sign that plants were growing again somewhere beyond the visible horizon. The third dove did not return at all, presumably finding land suitable for permanent habitation. Encouraged by this sign, Ziusudra began watching for other indicators that the waters were receding. Gradually, mountaintops appeared like islands in the distance. Then hilltops, then valleys partially filled with water but no longer completely submerged. When the boat finally came to rest on solid ground, Ziusudra's first act was to build an altar and offer sacrifices to the gods. The smoke from his offerings rose straight up into still air, carrying the sweet scent of gratitude to heaven. This was the first sacrifice made in the New World, the first prayer offered by the flood's survivors. Enki appeared to receive the offering, pleased that his chosen family had survived the ordeal. But he brought troubling news. The other gods were angry that any humans had escaped their judgment. Only Enki's clever wordplay had made the rescue possible, and even he could not guarantee the survivors' safety if they angered heaven again. The covenant that followed was simpler than later versions. No rainbow appeared as a sign, no elaborate promises were exchanged. Just a quiet understanding that the experiment would continue, that humanity would be given another chance, but that this chance came with conditions that must never be forgotten. Ziusudra and his family became the ancestors of all post-flood humanity. Their children repopulated the empty world, carrying forward fragments of pre-flood knowledge, but not its full power. They rebuilt cities, but smaller ones. They rediscovered technologies, but simpler ones. They remembered the flood, but dimly, like a half-forgotten nightmare. The story of Ziusudra survives on broken tablets, with crucial passages missing or damaged beyond repair. We know the beginning and the end, but the middle remains partly lost. Perhaps that's appropriate for a story about things that were meant to be forgotten. What we do know is this: Ziusudra was the first, but not the last. His story became Utnapishtim's story, which became Noah's story, which became countless other flood stories told around fires and preserved in sacred texts. Each retelling added new details, subtracted old ones, adapted the narrative to new audiences and new times. But the core remained constant: water rising, world ending, few surviving, covenant emerging. The pattern that would repeat whenever humanity grew too proud, too corrupt, too dangerous for its own good. The reset button that someone or something could always push when the experiment needed to start over. Ziusudra's name means life of distant days. He was the bridge between the world that was and the world that came after. The keeper of memories too important to lose, the guardian of life too precious to abandon. The first person to learn that survival sometimes requires letting go of everything except what matters most. In the quiet hours when rain patters against windows and wind howls around buildings, his story whispers from the depths of human memory. It reminds us that we are all flood survivors, all descendants of someone who built a boat when the waters rose, all carriers of knowledge preserved through catastrophe, all keepers of life saved from destruction. The tablets that tell his story continue to crack and crumble in museum storage rooms. Each year, more of his words become illegible, more of his wisdom fades into dust. But the memory persists, passed down through stories and songs, dreams and fears. Somewhere in our DNA, in the deepest layers of genetic memory, Ziusudra's experience echoes still. The memory of waters rising, of worlds ending, of starting over with nothing but hope and the determination to preserve what deserves preservation. His boat may have rotted away millennia ago. His altar may have crumbled to dust. His covenant may have been forgotten by those who made it. But his legacy survives in every flood story, every rescue operation, every act of preservation in the face of overwhelming destruction. Ziusudra, keeper of life, guardian of memory, first survivor of the flood that drowned the world. His story is our story, his choice our inheritance, his hope our foundation. The waters rose once, they may rise again. When they do, may we have the wisdom to build boats, the courage to save what matters, and the faith to believe that after every ending comes a new beginning. Gilgamesh and the boatman, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, Gilgamesh ruled Uruk with the strength of a god and the heart of a mortal. His friendship with Enkidu, his journey to find immortality, his encounter with the flood survivor, these stories were carved in stone when writing itself was young. But hidden within the epic lies a flood account that mirrors Genesis so closely it raises disturbing questions about which came first. After Enkidu's death, grief consumed Gilgamesh like fire. His best friend, his equal, his other half, gone to the underworld while he remained trapped in flesh that would also fail. For the first time, the great king understood that even heroes must die. Even demigods cannot escape the fate that awaits all living things. But Gilgamesh refused to accept mortality. Somewhere in the world lived Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood. If anyone knew the secret of eternal life, it would be the man whom the gods had granted immortality after the waters receded. Finding him became an obsession that drove everything else from the king's mind. The journey to Utnapishtim's dwelling place led through territories that no mortal had ever crossed. Mountains whose peaks scraped the belly of heaven, deserts where the sun burned hot enough to melt bronze. Seas that stretched beyond the edge of the world, patrolled by creatures that devoured ships and sailors with equal appetite. At the waters of death, Gilgamesh met Ur-Shanabi, the boatman. This mysterious figure possessed the only vessel capable of crossing the poisonous sea that surrounded Utnapishtim's island. But the crossing required special preparations, specific rituals, exact timing. One mistake would mean death in waters that killed even fish. The boat moved without wind or current, guided by knowledge that predated human navigation. As they crossed, Ur-Shanabi told stories of the time before the flood, when the sea had been dry land and great cities had prospered where now only water moved. He spoke of kings who lived for thousands of years, of buildings that touched the clouds, of secrets that had drowned with their keepers. Utnapishtim waited on the far shore, ancient beyond measurement, but still bearing the face of a man in his prime. Immortality had preserved his body, while his eyes accumulated the wisdom of ages. He greeted Gilgamesh with sadness rather than surprise, knowing why the young king had made such a perilous journey. "Why do you roam so far?" Utnapishtim asked. "The life you seek you shall not find. When the gods created mankind, they appointed death for man and kept life in their own hands. Fill your belly, Gilgamesh. Day and night make merry. Let every day be a festival. Dance and play by day and night." But Gilgamesh would not be dissuaded by philosophy. He demanded to know how Utnapishtim had achieved immortality, what secret knowledge had saved him from death's universal claim. The old man sighed, understanding that some lessons can only be learned through story. "I will tell you a hidden matter, Gilgamesh, and reveal to you a secret of the gods." And so began the flood story that would echo through every culture that came after. In the city of Shuruppak, Utnapishtim had served the god Ea faithfully when the divine assembly decided to destroy humanity with flood. Ea, bound by oath not to warn mortals directly, spoke instead to the reed wall of Utnapishtim's house, knowing that his servant would hear and understand. Reed house, wall, wall. Hear, O reed house, understand, O wall. Man of Shuruppak, son of Ubar-Tutu, demolish the house and build a boat. Abandon possessions and seek life. Spurn property and save living beings. Bring up into the boat the seed of all living creatures. The boat's dimensions were precise, equal length, width, and height, like a cube floating on water. 7 decks divided the interior space. 9 compartments on each level provided shelter for different types of creatures. The entire structure was sealed with bitumen inside and out, waterproofed against the deluge that would submerge the world. Construction took 7 days. Utnapishtim's family and workers labored without rest, following Ea's detailed specifications. The whole city watched with growing amazement as the enormous vessel took shape. When curious neighbors asked about its purpose, Utnapishtim could only say that he was leaving their region because Enlil had grown angry with him. On the appointed day, the sky darkened ominously. Shamash, the sun god, gave the signal. When the rider of the storm sends down a destroying rain, then enter the boat and close your door. The final loading began immediately. Animals, birds, reptiles, insects, seeds, supplies, and Utnapishtim's extended family and household. The storm arrived with unprecedented fury. Rain fell like spears from heaven. Wind howled with the voices of demons. The earth shook as if trying to throw off the water that covered it. Even the gods were terrified by the violence they had unleashed, cowering like dogs in heaven's highest reaches. For 6 days and 7 nights, the flood, wind, and rainstorm swept over the land. The tempest stilled only on the 7th day, leaving behind silence that felt like death itself. From the boat's window, Utnapishtim saw an ocean where land had been. All humanity had returned to clay, just as the gods intended. The boat drifted until it grounded on Mount Nemush, which held it fast and would not let it move. After 7 more days, Utnapishtim released a dove. It flew away but found no resting place and returned. A swallow followed with the same result. Finally, a raven flew out and did not return, having found land and food. So when Utnapishtim emerged from the boat, his first act was to offer sacrifice on the mountain's peak. The sweet savor reached the gods, who gathered around the offering like flies. They had not realized how much they would miss human worship until it disappeared beneath the floodwaters. Enlil arrived in fury, discovering that some humans had survived his perfect destruction. But Ea defended his cleverness. How could you bring about a flood without reflection? Charge the sinner with his sin, charge the criminal with his crime, but be merciful lest mankind be cut off, be patient lest they be killed. The gods debated humanity's fate while Utnapishtim waited on the mountain. Finally, they reached a compromise. Enlil touched Utnapishtim's forehead and spoke. Formerly, Utnapishtim was a human being, but now Utnapishtim and his wife shall be like gods. In the distance, at the mouth of the rivers, Utnapishtim shall dwell. And so the flood survivor received immortality, not as reward for righteousness, but as compensation for divine error. The gods had overreacted, destroying too much in their anger. Granting eternal life to the one they had wronged was their attempt at cosmic justice. But immortality came with exile. Utnapishtim could never return to the world of mortals. He lived beyond the waters of death, separated from humanity by barriers that only the most determined heroes could cross. His knowledge was preserved, but isolated, available only to those willing to risk everything to find it. Gilgamesh listened to this account with growing excitement. If the gods had granted immortality once, perhaps they could be persuaded to grant it again. But Utnapishtim's response crushed such hopes. Who will assemble the gods for you, that you may find the life you seek? Instead, he offered a test. If Gilgamesh could stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, perhaps he would prove worthy of immortality. But the great king fell asleep almost immediately, demonstrating that he could not even conquer ordinary human weakness, let alone death itself. As consolation, Utnapishtim revealed the location of a plant that restored youth. Gilgamesh dove to the ocean floor and retrieved this thorny herb, planning to test it on elderly citizens of Uruk before using it himself. But on the journey home, while bathing in a pool, a serpent smelled the plant's fragrance and stole it, shedding its skin and disappearing into the water. Gilgamesh wept for his lost immortality, but Urshanabi the boatman offered perspective. For whom have you toiled, Gilgamesh? For whom have you exhausted your strength? You have not obtained life, but you have made glad the heart of a serpent. The king returned to Uruk empty-handed but wiser. He had learned that immortality belonged to the gods alone, that human glory lay not in avoiding death, but in creating works that would outlast mortal flesh. His epic itself became such a work, preserving his story long after his body returned to dust. But questions linger in the spaces between cuneiform wedges. Why does Utnapishtim's flood story match Genesis so exactly? Which version came first, and why are they so similar? Did ancient scribes copy from each other, or did both preserve memories of the same catastrophic event? The parallels extend beyond basic plot to specific details. Divine warning, boat construction, animal collection, family salvation, dove release, mountain landing, sacrifice offering, divine covenant. The match is too precise for coincidence, too detailed for independent invention. Perhaps both stories recall the same historical flood, passed down through different cultural traditions. Perhaps one influenced the other through trade routes or conquests. Or perhaps both reflect an even older source, a proto-narrative that spawned all subsequent flood accounts. Whatever their relationship, both epics agree on essentials. The world ended in water. A few survived through divine intervention. Knowledge was preserved but limited. Immortality remained beyond human reach. And somewhere, in the space between memory and myth, the truth about what really happened continues to wait for discovery. Babylon's city of the dead. Beneath the shifting sands of modern Iraq, ancient cities sleep in silence. Eridu, where kingship first descended from heaven. Shuruppak, home of the flood hero. Abraham's birthplace. Babylon, where tongues were scattered. Each site holds secrets that archaeologists have spent lifetimes trying to uncover. But it was at Tel Farah, the ruins of ancient Shuruppak, that shovels first struck evidence that made flood myths seem less mythical. In 1902, German excavations revealed something that no one expected to find, a layer of clean river silt separating older ruins from newer ones. 8 feet of flood deposit, sterile and uniform, marking a catastrophe that had buried an entire civilization. The stratigraphy told a clear story. Below the silt layer lay the remains of a sophisticated city, well-built houses, advanced pottery, cuneiform tablets, evidence of complex urban life. Above the layer, a completely different culture had built simpler structures, cruder artifacts, more primitive technology. Something had happened between these two occupations, something that involved a tremendous amount of water. Leonard Woolley's excavations at in the 1920s uncovered similar evidence. Digging down through accumulated debris, his team reached what appeared to be virgin soil, clean, water-laid clay that suggested they had reached the bottom of human habitation. But Woolley ordered them to dig deeper, intuition telling him that the story was not yet complete. 11 feet down, they broke through the clay into another layer of human occupation. More pottery, different in style from anything found above. More buildings laid out according to different principles. More tablets written in scripts that predated the flood layer by centuries or millennia. The implications were staggering. Here was physical evidence of the biblical flood, proof that water had indeed covered the earth and destroyed previous civilizations. The clean silt could only have been deposited by massive flooding, the kind that could reshape entire landscapes. But skeptics raised questions that complicated the triumphant announcements. The flood layers at different sites were not uniform in depth or composition. Some contained 8 feet of silt, others only a few inches. Some showed evidence of river flooding, others of marine incursion. Dating techniques revealed that the floods had occurred at different times, separated by centuries or millennia. Perhaps most problematic, the flood layers covered only limited geographic areas. Excavations at sites just a few miles away showed no evidence of catastrophic flooding. If this was the biblical deluge that covered the entire earth, why were its traces so localized? Alternative explanations emerged. Mesopotamia was prone to periodic flooding when spring melts in the Zagros Mountains combined with heavy rains to overwhelm the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. Such floods could devastate individual cities while leaving nearby settlements untouched. To survivors of a local catastrophe, the event might well have seemed like the end of the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself provides clues about the flood's limited scope. Utnapishtim's boat grounds on Mount Nimush, identified with modern Pir Omar Gudrun in the Zagros foothills. This location suggests a flood originating in the northern mountains and flowing south toward the Persian Gulf, exactly the pattern of natural Mesopotamian flooding. But other evidence pointed toward something more dramatic than ordinary river overflow. Geological surveys revealed massive underwater fans of sediment extending far into the Persian Gulf, deposits that could only have been created by truly catastrophic water flows. Core samples from the Gulf floor showed layers of freshwater sediment that suggested enormous volumes of river water had poured into the sea within relatively short periods. The Black Sea hypothesis added another dimension to flood research. Geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that the Mediterranean had broken through the Bosphorus around 5600 BCE, creating a massive waterfall that rapidly filled the Black Sea basin. This event would have displaced thousands of farming communities around the Black Sea's shores, forcing them to migrate to new territories throughout the Middle East. Archaeological evidence supported this theory. Excavations around the Black Sea revealed submerged settlements dating to before the proposed catastrophe. Underwater surveys discovered ancient river channels, now drowned beneath hundreds of feet of water. The timing matched the earliest Mesopotamian settlements, suggesting that flood refugees might have carried flood stories with them to their new homes. But the most intriguing discoveries came from underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf. In 2010, researchers identified submerged structures off the coast of Kuwait that appeared to be artificial constructions rather than natural formations. Sonar mapping revealed geometric patterns consistent with urban planning, suggesting that cities had indeed existed in areas now covered by water. Similar discoveries followed throughout the Gulf region. Satellite imagery revealed what appeared to be ancient river systems, now drowned beneath the Persian Gulf. These paleochannels suggested that sea levels had been much lower in the past, allowing human settlement in areas that are now underwater. The implications were profound. If the Persian Gulf had been dry land during the early Holocene, it could have supported large populations in river valleys fed by the combined Tigris-Euphrates system. When sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, these settlements would have been inundated, forcing mass migrations that could have carried flood stories throughout the ancient world. Carbon dating of coral reefs in the Persian Gulf confirmed that sea levels had risen dramatically around 8,000 to 6,000 BCE, precisely the period when flood myths began appearing in Mesopotamian literature. The timing was too precise for coincidence, too consistent across multiple lines of evidence to dismiss, but physical evidence for the flood remained frustratingly incomplete. The silt layers at Mesopotamian sites proved to be from different floods at different times, not a single global catastrophe. The underwater structures in the Persian Gulf awaited detailed examination to confirm their artificial origin. The Black Sea flood, while dramatic, affected only a limited region. Perhaps most importantly, no archaeological site had produced unambiguous evidence of the advanced pre-flood civilization described in ancient texts. The cultures buried beneath flood layers were sophisticated for their time, but they showed no signs of the extraordinary technologies or extended lifespans attributed to antediluvian societies, unless the real evidence lay deeper than anyone had yet dug, unless the most important sites remained undiscovered, hidden beneath layers of sediment that had accumulated over millennia, unless the true scope of the flood's destruction was so complete that it had erased almost every trace of what came before. Recent advances in ground-penetrating radar and satellite archaeology have begun revealing anomalies that previous generations of excavators could not detect. Geometric patterns buried beneath known sites, suggesting multiple layers of occupation extending far deeper than surface excavations had reached. Metallic signatures that indicated the presence of large artificial structures in areas where no ancient construction was previously known. These discoveries hint at the possibility that the flood archaeology of the past century has only scratched the surface of what remains to be found. That beneath the ruins of Babylon and and Eridu lie the remains of even older cities, settlements that predated the flood catastrophe and were buried so deeply that they have escaped archaeological attention. The city of the dead may not be dead at all, but sleeping. Waiting for the right technology, the right techniques, the right questions to wake it from its long slumber beneath the sand, waiting to tell its story of what really happened when the waters rose and the old world drowned. In the meantime, the debate continues in academic journals and excavation reports, in conference presentations and grant applications. Each new discovery adds pieces to a puzzle that remains stubbornly incomplete. Each new theory raises questions that demand new evidence. But deep beneath the modern cities of Iraq, deeper than the archaeologists have yet reached, deeper than the floodwaters penetrated, something waits. Something that remembers the world before the deluge, the civilization that perished in the waters, the knowledge that was lost when the cities died. The dead keep their secrets well, but they do not keep them forever. Noah's real ark, on the slopes of Mount Ararat, 15,400 feet above sea level, something waits in the ice. Satellite images show an anomaly in the glacier, a geometric shadow that looks almost like a ship frozen in time. For centuries, explorers and believers have risked their lives climbing these treacherous slopes, searching for the physical remains of Noah's Ark. The mountain dominates the horizon across eastern Turkey, a massive volcanic peak that local Kurdish people call Agri Dagi, the Mountain of Pain. Ancient Armenian texts called it the Mother of the World, the place where Earth first emerged from the waters of creation. Both Jewish and Islamic traditions identify it as the Ark's final resting place. But Ararat is not the only claimant to this honor. Jebel Judi in southern Turkey has equally ancient credentials mentioned in the Quran as the Ark's landing site. Mount Nisir in northern Iraq fits the Mesopotamian flood accounts. The Darupanar site, 13 miles from Ararat, shows a boat-shaped formation that some researchers insist is the petrified remains of Noah's vessel. Each location has passionate defenders and damning critics. Each has produced evidence that seems compelling to believers and unconvincing to skeptics. Each raises more questions than it answers about what really happened when the waters receded and the ark came to rest. The search for Noah's Ark began in modern times with Friedrich Parrot's 1829 ascent of Ararat. The German naturalist reached the summit but found no trace of ancient wood. His account mentioned local legends about a ship preserved in the mountain's ice, visible only during years when the snow melted enough to reveal the glacier's secrets. Subsequent expeditions reported tantalizing glimpses. In 1876, British politician James Bryce claimed to have found a piece of hand-tooled wood at 13,000 feet, far above the tree line where no natural wood should exist. Russian aviator Vladimir Roskovitsky reported seeing the outline of a large vessel from the air in 1916, but World War I prevented ground investigation. The most famous sighting came in 1949 when U.S. Air Force photography revealed what appeared to be a ship-like structure embedded in ice near Ararat's summit. The Pentagon classified the images, fueling decades of speculation about government cover-ups and suppressed evidence. When the photos were finally declassified, they showed interesting formations but nothing definitively artificial. George Hagopian's childhood memories added emotional weight to the search. The Armenian American claimed that his uncle had taken him to see the Ark in 1908, describing a massive wooden structure protruding from a glacier. Hagopian's detailed recollections, recorded decades later, matched other reported sightings and provided specific location information that guided subsequent expeditions. But the mountain itself resisted every attempt at confirmation. Ararat sits in a politically unstable region, its slopes mined and patrolled by Turkish military forces suspicious of foreign researchers. The altitude causes severe physical stress, the weather changes without warning, and avalanches have killed numerous expedition members over the years. Even reaching the supposed Ark sites requires extraordinary logistics. Equipment must be helicoptered to base camps, then carried by hand across glacial terrain that can shift overnight. The thin air at high altitude makes every step exhausting, every decision potentially fatal. Storms can trap climbers for days in conditions that quickly become life-threatening. The few expeditions that have reached the highest ice formations have found natural rock outcroppings, not artificial structures. Core samples from the glaciers contain no preserved wood. Ground-penetrating radar detects geological formations, but no large hollow spaces that might indicate a buried vessel. Carbon dating of wood fragments claimed to be from the Ark consistently shows medieval or modern origins, suggesting either contamination or deliberate hoaxing. Chemical analysis reveals species native to lower elevations, not the ancient woods that the Ark would presumably have been constructed from. The Durupinar site, discovered in 1959 by Turkish Army Captain İlhan Durupinar, presented a different type of evidence. Aerial photographs showed a formation near Dogubayazit that resembled a large boat, complete with what appeared to be ribs and decking structures. The object measured approximately 515 feet long, close to the biblical dimensions for Noah's Ark. Ron Wyatt's investigation of the Durupinar site in the 1980s generated massive publicity and fierce controversy. Using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, Wyatt claimed to have found iron spikes, metal brackets, and fossilized wood arranged in patterns consistent with ship construction. His discoveries were featured in documentaries and books that reached millions of believers worldwide. But professional archaeologists who examined Wyatt's evidence found natural geological formations, not artificial construction. The iron spikes were iron-rich mineral deposits. The wood patterns were sedimentary layers. The ship-like shape resulted from a landslide that had created an optical illusion when viewed from above. Turkish authorities established the site as a national park and erected monuments declaring it to be Noah's Ark, but subsequent scientific investigation confirmed the geological explanation. The formation was natural, not the remains of an ancient vessel, regardless of its superficial resemblance to a ship. Alternative theories emerged to explain the persistent search for physical remains. Perhaps the Ark had been constructed from materials that would not survive millennia of exposure to ice and weather. Perhaps it had been deliberately destroyed by survivors who wanted to prevent it from becoming an object of idolatry. Perhaps it had never been intended as a literal vessel, but represented something entirely different. Some researchers proposed that the Ark was not a ship at all, but a sophisticated shelter built to preserve knowledge rather than people. Ancient texts describe the ark containing not just animals, but seeds, tools, books, and artifacts, essentially a library and laboratory designed to restart civilization after the flood. This interpretation suggested that the search for wooden ships was fundamentally misguided. If the ark was primarily an information storage system, its physical remains might be far smaller than expected, buried in caves or ruins rather than preserved on mountaintops. Others argued that the Ark story was allegorical from the beginning, a teaching tool designed to convey spiritual truths rather than historical facts. The obsession with finding physical evidence missed the point entirely, reducing profound theological concepts to material archaeology. But the search continues, driven by faith that transcends scientific skepticism. New expeditions launch every few years, equipped with better technology and renewed determination. Satellite imagery grows more sophisticated, revealing details previously invisible to human observers. Ground-penetrating radar becomes more sensitive, capable of detecting smaller anomalies buried deeper in ice and rock. Each new expedition generates excitement among believers and eye-rolling among academics. Each claimed discovery faces immediate scrutiny from critics who have seen too many previous announcements collapse under investigation. Each piece of evidence becomes part of an ongoing debate that shows no signs of resolution. Perhaps the real significance of the Ark search lies not in what it finds, but in what it reveals about human nature. The need to touch the physical remnants of miraculous events to prove that ancient stories were literally true, to bridge the gap between faith and sight with concrete evidence. The mountain keeps its secrets, if it has any to keep. The ice preserves some things and destroys others according to laws that care nothing for human hopes or beliefs. The truth about Noah's Ark, whatever that truth might be, waits somewhere between the testimony of ancient texts and the silence of modern glaciers. High on Ararat's slopes, the search continues. Climbers risk their lives for glimpses of something that may or may not exist, may or may not matter, may or may not change anything, even if found. The mountain watches with the patience of stone, holding its secrets as firmly as it holds the ice that never completely melts. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the search itself is the point, the journey more important than the destination, the faith more significant than the proof. Perhaps Noah's real ark is not buried in ice at all, but carried in the hearts of those who believe that somewhere, somehow, remnants of the ancient world survive. Waiting to be discovered, waiting to tell their story, waiting to prove that the flood was real, the rescue was genuine, and the promise of preservation extends far beyond the boundaries of any single ship. The Lost Cities of the Flood documentary script, parts 11 to 20. The Lost Sons of God. In the quiet moments before dawn, ancient texts whisper of beings who walked between heaven and earth. The Nephilim, they were called, giants born from a union that should never have been. Genesis speaks briefly of them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. From this forbidden love came children unlike any the world had seen. Towering figures who cast shadows across entire valleys, warriors whose strength could level mountains. But the Hebrew word carries deeper meaning. Nephilim means the fallen ones. Not fallen from grace, but fallen from the sky itself. Beings who descended from realms beyond mortal understanding, bringing with them knowledge that would reshape the world. The Book of Enoch tells their story with startling detail. 200 angels watched the earth from their heavenly posts. They saw human women and desired them. Their leader Semyaza made a pact with his followers. "Let us all swear an oath," he said, "and bind ourselves by mutual curses not to abandon this plan." They came down upon Mount Hermon. The mountain's name means devoted to destruction. Perhaps they knew what their choice would bring. These watchers taught humanity secrets meant to remain hidden. Azazel showed men how to make weapons of war. Swords that could cut through stones, that could deflect the mightiest blow. Kokabeel revealed the mysteries of the stars, teaching astrology and divination. Barakel taught the signs of lightning. Armaros showed how to break enchantments. The women they chose bore children who grew beyond all natural limits. Some texts say they reached 300 cubits in height. Others claim they consumed the food of 1,000 men each day. Their appetites were endless, their hunger insatiable. These giants built cities that touched the clouds. They carved their names into cliffs that still stand today. In some forgotten corners of the earth, their handprints remain pressed into stone, each finger the size of a grown man's arm. The Anakim descended from them. When Moses sent spies into the Promised Land, they returned trembling. "We saw the Nephilim there," they reported. "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." But the giants' legacy was not one of wonder. They brought violence to the earth. Brother turned against brother. Cities burned while their inhabitants fled. The strong devoured the weak, and the weak learned to worship strength above all else. The Rephaim, another race of giants, ruled vast territories. Their king of Bashan slept in a bed of iron 9 cubits long. When he fell in battle, it took 6 men to lift his sword. Their cities sprawled across the landscape like scars upon the earth. Yet for all their might, the giants carried within them the seeds of their own destruction. They were beings caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Too earthly for heaven, too heavenly for earth. This divided nature made them restless, always seeking what they could never find. The flood came, and they perished. Their bodies turned to dust, but their spirits, the texts say, became the demons that plague humanity still. Neither fully alive nor fully dead, they wander the earth hungry for the flesh they lost, desperate to reclaim what the waters took away. Some scholars believe the giants' destruction was not complete. Hidden valleys might still shelter their descendants. Remote mountains might still echo with their voices. The earth keeps its secrets well, but sometimes in the deepest caves or the highest peaks, explorers find bones too large to explain. Footprints pressed into rock that tell stories science struggles to accept. The giants were the first to fall, but they would not be the last. Their tale reminds us that power without wisdom leads to ruin, that knowledge without compassion breeds destruction, that even the mighty must answer for their choices when the waters rise. The Watchers' cities. Imagine cities that rose like prayers toward heaven, towers that pierced the clouds, their peaks lost in mist and starlight. The Watchers and their giant children built wonders that would make our modern world seem primitive by comparison. These were not crude settlements of mud and stone. The fallen angels brought knowledge from celestial realms, teaching their offspring to work with materials that seemed to bend reality itself. Metals that never tarnished, stones that floated in the air, crystals that captured and focused light like living things. The city of Enoch was said to be the greatest of them all. Named for the righteous man who walked with God, it stretched across a valley so vast that a man could walk for days and never reach its borders. Its walls were built from blocks of green stone, each one perfectly fitted without mortar. The gates were carved from single pieces of obsidian, black as midnight but transparent as glass. Within these walls, the Watchers taught their children the secrets of the forge. They showed them how to fold metal upon itself, creating alloys stronger than any found in nature, swords that could cut through armor as if it were cloth, shields that could turn aside the mightiest blows, tools that never dulled, never broke, never failed their users. But their knowledge went beyond simple craftsmanship. They understood the hidden properties of matter itself, how to make stone float, how to bend light around objects, rendering them invisible, how to create fire that burned without fuel, water that flowed uphill, air that carried voices across impossible distances. The towers they built defied every law of physics we understand today. Some rose straight up, narrow as needles but tall as mountains. Others spiraled toward the sky, their surfaces covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. A few were built upside down, their foundations hanging from the clouds, their peaks touching the earth. Inside these impossible structures, the giants pursued knowledge with endless hunger. They mapped the movements of stars, charting patterns that would not repeat for thousands of years. They studied the properties of plants and stones, learning to extract essences that could heal or harm with equal power. They delved into the nature of time itself, seeking ways to stretch moments into eternities or compress years into heartbeats. Their architecture reflected their divided nature. Part of every building reached toward heaven, south, while another part burrowed deep into the earth. Stairs descended into darkness, leading to chambers where the watchers conducted their most secret experiments. Halls that seemed to exist in several dimensions at once, where a single step could carry a person miles from where they started. The giants were master astronomers, but their observatories were unlike anything we might imagine. They built massive mirrors from polished metal, each one larger than a house. These reflected not just light, but time itself, allowing them to peer into the past and future. They constructed elaborate mechanical devices that tracked the movements of celestial bodies, predicting eclipses and conjunctions with perfect accuracy. Water flowed through their cities in ways that seemed impossible, fountains that spurted upward for hundreds of feet, never needing pumps or pressure. Streams that ran in perfect circles, never beginning, never ending. Pools that reflected not the sky above, but distant lands and times. The streets themselves were works of art, paved with stones that changed color with the weather, marked with symbols that glowed softly in the darkness, guiding travelers even on the blackest nights. Some roads were said to carry people along without walking, moving them from place to place as if they were leaves on a gentle current. Gardens grew in impossible profusion. Plants from every corner of the earth and some from beyond the earth entirely. Trees that bore fruit of solid gold, flowers that sang in harmony with the wind, vines that climbed not just walls but the very air itself, their leaves catching stardust and moonbeams. Yet for all their beauty, these cities carried a shadow. The giants' appetites were vast, their needs endless. They consumed not just food and water, but the very life force of the land around them. Fields withered in their presence. Rivers ran dry. The sky itself seemed to darken above their towers. The watchers had given their children knowledge, but not wisdom. They had taught them to build, but not why to build. They had shown them power, but not restraint. And so their cities became monuments to their own excess, beautiful prisons that trapped them in their own desires. When the flood came, these wonders vanished beneath the waves. But sometimes, in the deepest parts of the ocean, explorers claim to see lights moving in formations too regular to be natural, structures too large to be made by human hands. The cities of the giants, perhaps, waiting in the darkness for the waters to recede once more. Forbidden archaeology. Deep beneath the ocean floor, strange objects rest in silence. Artifacts that don't belong to any known civilization. Tools made from materials that shouldn't exist. Evidence of technologies that our ancestors supposedly never possessed. The mainstream tells us human civilization began with simple farming communities, small groups that slowly learned to work metal, build cities, and develop writing. A gradual climb from caves to pyramids over thousands of years. But the Earth keeps revealing things that don't fit this neat timeline. Metallic spheres found in rocks millions of years old, footprints preserved in stone that should predate humanity by eons, machines embedded in coal seams that formed long before humans walked the earth. In 1851, workers in Massachusetts discovered a metallic vase embedded in solid rock. The rock was over 600 million years old, yet the vase showed clear signs of being crafted by skilled hands. Its surface bore intricate patterns that spoke of advanced metallurgy and artistic vision. Romanian aluminum wedge, discovered in 1974, poses similar questions. Aluminum wasn't refined by humans until the 1800s, yet this object was found alongside mastodon bones in layers dating back 20,000 years. Its composition and shape suggest it was part of a larger mechanism, perhaps a tool or component of some ancient machine. The Antikythera mechanism, pulled from a Greek shipwreck, contains gears and calculations that shouldn't have been possible for its time. This bronze computer could predict eclipses, track planetary movements, and calculate the positions of celestial bodies with startling accuracy. Its existence suggests that ancient Greek knowledge far exceeded what we previously believed. But these are just the beginning. Across the world, researchers have documented thousands of artifacts that challenge our understanding of the past. Stone tools found in geological layers that predate accepted human migration patterns. Pottery fragments recovered from depths that suggest civilizations existed long before our current timeline allows. The London hammer, encased in Ordovician rock supposedly 400 million years old, raises uncomfortable questions. The metal shows signs of being manufactured, not naturally formed. Its handle has partially fossilized, suggesting it has been embedded in the rock for an extremely long time. In the coal mines of Europe and America, workers have found objects that shouldn't exist. Golden chains, iron pots, and metallic cubes discovered in coal seams that formed 300 million years ago. Each discovery is carefully documented, photographed, and then quietly filed away. Ancient maps present their own mysteries. The Peary Race map, drawn in 1513, shows the coastline of Antarctica with remarkable accuracy. But Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and its ice-free coastline hasn't been visible for thousands of years. How did medieval cartographers know details that shouldn't have been available to them? The Bauval correlation theory suggests that the pyramids of Giza were built to mirror the constellation Orion, but not as it appeared when the pyramids were supposedly constructed. Instead, they match the star pattern as it would have appeared around 10,500 BCE, thousands of years before Egyptian civilization is thought to have begun. Stone circles and megalithic structures worldwide share common features that suggest shared knowledge or contact between distant civilizations. Precise astronomical alignments, similar construction techniques, and mathematical proportions that appear across continents and cultures. These similarities hint at a lost period of global communication and cooperation. The Nazca lines in Peru can only be fully appreciated from the air, yet they were created by people who supposedly had no flying technology. The precision of these massive drawings, their scale and accuracy, suggests either advanced surveying techniques or the ability to view them from above. Underwater ruins off the coasts of Japan, India, and the Caribbean show evidence of sophisticated architecture and planning. These structures rest beneath hundreds of feet of water in areas that have been submerged for thousands of years. Their existence suggests that advanced civilizations flourished when sea levels were much lower. The megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru are built with stones so perfectly fitted that a knife blade cannot slip between them. Some of these stones weigh over 100 tons, yet they were quarried miles away and lifted into position with precision that challenges modern engineering capabilities. Genetic studies of ancient human remains reveal DNA patterns that don't match current theories of human migration and development. Unusual genetic markers that appear in widely separated populations suggest either contact between distant groups or inheritance from common ancestors who possessed greater technological capabilities than we previously believed. The Baghdad battery, discovered in Iraq, consists of a ceramic jar containing a copper cylinder and iron rod. When filled with an acidic solution, it produces electrical current. The artifact dates to around 250 BCE, over 2,000 years before electricity was supposedly discovered. These discoveries share common characteristics. They're found in contexts that predate accepted timelines. They demonstrate knowledge or technology that shouldn't have existed. And they're often dismissed, ignored, or explained away, rather than integrated into our understanding of the past. The implications are staggering. If even a fraction of these artifacts are genuine, they suggest that human civilization has much deeper roots than we currently believe, that advanced knowledge has been lost and rediscovered multiple times throughout history, that the flood myths might preserve memories of real civilizations that possess technologies we're only beginning to understand. Atlantis and the flood connection. Plato told a story that has captivated minds for over 2,000 years, an island civilization of incredible power and sophistication swallowed by the sea in a single day and night. Atlantis, he called it, a place where wisdom and technology flourished beyond imagination. The philosopher claimed he learned this tale from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests. They spoke of a time 9,000 years before their own, when a great island nation controlled vast territories across the Atlantic. Its people possessed knowledge that seemed almost divine, building cities that gleamed like jewels beneath the sun. According to Plato's account, Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined. Its capital sat on a plain surrounded by mountains, with the royal palace at its center. Concentric rings of water and land surrounded the palace, connected by tunnels large enough for ships to pass through. The entire arrangement was so perfectly planned that it seemed more dream than reality. The Atlanteans had mastered the arts of peace and war alike. Their ships could traverse oceans with ease. Their armies could conquer distant lands. Their architects could build structures that defied the laws of physics. They had tamed the forces of nature itself, channeling the power of the earth to serve their needs. But this is where the story connects to something much older. The timeline Plato provided places Atlantis' destruction around 9600 BCE, remarkably close to the date many scholars assign to the Great Flood described in Genesis and other ancient texts. Could these two catastrophes be the same event, remembered differently by different cultures? The similarities are striking. Both describe the destruction of a corrupt civilization by water. Both involve divine punishment for human hubris. Both result in the loss of advanced knowledge and technology. Both leave only scattered survivors to rebuild the world. Plato described the Atlanteans as becoming corrupt over time. They began as noble people, descendants of the god Poseidon himself. But gradually, their divine nature was diluted by mixing with mortal blood. They became greedy, aggressive, and proud. They used their power to dominate others rather than to help them. This mirrors the biblical account of the Nephilim and their human descendants. The Book of Enoch tells of how the children of the Watchers became increasingly violent and corrupt. They used their inherited knowledge not for the benefit of humanity, but to satisfy their own endless appetites. The geographical clues in Plato's story have sparked countless theories about Atlantis' location. Some place it in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Others suggest the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, or even the Americas. But what if the location matters less than the story itself? Many flood myths describe islands or continents that vanished beneath the waves. The Hindu Puranas tell of Dwarka, Krishna's golden city that sank into the sea. Celtic legends speak of Lyonesse, a land between Cornwall and the Scilly Isles that was swallowed by the ocean. Aboriginal Australians remember Lemuria, a continent that connected their ancestors to distant lands. These stories share common elements with both Atlantis and the biblical flood: advanced civilizations that became corrupt, divine punishment in the form of water, the loss of knowledge and technology, the scattering of survivors to distant lands. Recent archaeological discoveries have added new dimensions to these old stories. Underwater ruins off the coast of Japan, India, and the Caribbean suggest that sophisticated civilizations did exist in areas now covered by the sea. Rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age could have submerged these settlements, creating the memories preserved in flood myths. The Younger Dryas period, around 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, saw dramatic climate changes and rising sea levels. Coastlines shifted rapidly, swallowing low-lying areas where early civilizations might have flourished. Survivors of these catastrophes would have carried memories of their lost homelands, stories that evolved into the myths we know today. Plato's Atlantis might not have been a single island, but a symbol representing all the advanced civilizations lost to the post-glacial floods. The story would then serve as a warning about the dangers of corruption and hubris, using the memory of real catastrophes to teach moral lessons. The technology Plato attributed to Atlantis sounds fantastical, but it might preserve dim memories of real capabilities. The Atlanteans supposedly used crystals to focus energy, built flying machines, and communicated across vast distances. If the antediluvian world really did possess advanced knowledge, these details might be garbled memories of actual technologies. The division of Atlantis into 10 kingdoms ruled by Poseidon's sons echoes the biblical account of how the earth was divided among Noah's descendants after the flood. Both stories describe the establishment of new civilizations from the survivors of a great catastrophe. The metals Plato described, including the mysterious orichalcum, might represent advanced alloys or materials known to the antediluvian world but lost after the flood. Many ancient texts speak of metals with properties that modern science struggles to explain. The Atlantis story, viewed through the lens of flood mythology, becomes less about finding a lost city and more about understanding a lost world. A civilization that rose to great heights, fell to great depths, and left only memories to guide those who came after. Whether Atlantis was real or symbolic, it represents humanity's eternal struggle between wisdom and folly, between using knowledge to build and using it to destroy. The flood that claimed it, whether literal or metaphorical, reminds us that even the mightiest civilizations are not immune to the consequences of their choices. The God who regretted. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, Genesis tells us something startling about the divine nature. The Lord, creator of all things, looked upon the earth and regretted that he had made humanity. This moment of divine regret stands as one of the most profound and troubling passages in all of Scripture. Here is the all-knowing, all-powerful God expressing something that sounds remarkably like sorrow, disappointment, even a kind of cosmic grief. The Hebrew word used here carries layers of meaning that simple translation cannot capture. It suggests not just regret, but a deep emotional pain, the kind that comes from watching something you love destroy itself. This was not the cold calculation of a distant deity, but the anguish of a parent watching their children choose paths that lead to ruin. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. The image is almost too human to comprehend. The creator of the universe, experiencing heartbreak over the creatures he had shaped from dust and breath. What had humanity done to provoke such divine anguish? The text tells us that every inclination of human hearts was only evil all the time. Violence filled the earth. The strong oppressed the weak. Corruption spread like a plague through every level of society. But there was more to it than simple human wickedness. The union between the sons of God and daughters of men had produced the Nephilim, beings whose very existence was an affront to the natural order. These giants had introduced knowledge and violence that accelerated humanity's descent into chaos. The Watchers had taught forbidden arts. Azazel showed humans how to make weapons of war. Others revealed the secrets of cosmetics and jewelry, leading to vanity and lust. Barakel taught the signs of lightning and thunder, perhaps the beginnings of weather manipulation. Kokabil shared the mysteries of the stars, knowledge that was meant to remain in heaven. Each of these gifts, innocent in themselves, became tools of corruption in human hands. The knowledge of metalworking led to better weapons. The understanding of herbs led to poisons. The secrets of the stars led to divination and worship of false gods. God's regret was not about making a mistake. The all-knowing creator could hardly be surprised by human behavior. Instead, it was about the pain of watching free will choose destruction over life, chaos over order, selfishness over love. The decision to destroy the world was made in anger, but in grief. Like a surgeon who must cut away diseased tissue to save the patient, God chose to wash the earth clean and begin again. The flood was not vengeance, but a kind of cosmic reset, a chance for creation to start over. But even in destruction, mercy remained. Noah and his family were preserved, along with representatives of all living creatures. The rainbow after the flood became a sign of promise. God's covenant never again to destroy the earth by water. Yet questions linger. If God truly regretted making humanity, why preserve any of it? If the corruption was so complete, why not start over entirely with new creatures? The answers point to something deeper in the divine nature, a love that persists even in the face of betrayal. The story suggests that God's regret was not about humanity's potential, but about the choices they had made. The image of God was still there, buried beneath layers of corruption and violence. Noah represented that image preserved, a remnant of what humanity could be when it chose to walk in righteousness. The psychological portrait of God in this story is complex and unsettling. This is not the distant, unchanging deity of philosophical theology, but a being capable of deep emotion, someone who can be hurt by the actions of his creatures. The grief is real, the pain genuine. Some scholars argue that these human emotions attributed to God are simply literary devices, ways of helping finite minds understand infinite realities. Others suggest they reveal something fundamental about the divine nature, that love and relationship are not incidental to God's character, but central to it. The regret also reveals something about creation itself. If God could regret making humanity, then creation was not just a divine experiment, but a genuine risk. Free will meant the possibility of genuine choice, including the choice to reject the Creator's plan. The flood story, seen through this lens, becomes less about divine wrath and more about divine heartbreak. It's the story of a God who loved enough to take risks, who cared enough to feel pain, who grieved deeply enough to start over rather than simply abandon the project. The waters that covered the earth were not just instruments of destruction, but tears of divine sorrow. The God who regretted was the same God who remembered Noah, who preserved life even in the midst of judgment, who set his bow in the clouds as a sign of hope. This divine regret echoes through the rest of Scripture. The God who grieved over the antediluvian world would later grieve over Israel's unfaithfulness, over Jerusalem's destruction, over humanity's continued choice of darkness over light. The capacity for regret, far from being a divine weakness, becomes a sign of divine love. In the end, the story of God's regret is also the story of his persistence. Despite the heartbreak, despite the necessary destruction, despite humanity's continued failures, the divine love endures. The God who regretted making humanity in Genesis is the same God who, in the fullness of time, would become human himself to redeem what seemed irredeemable. Floods as control myths. Stories have power. They shape how we see the world, how we understand our place in it, how we respond to authority and change. The great flood myths that appear in nearly every culture on Earth carry within them messages about order, chaos, and the price of stepping outside accepted boundaries. These tales do more than entertain or educate. They serve as tools of social control, subtle but effective ways of shaping behavior and reinforcing power structures. The flood story, in particular, has been used throughout history to justify authority, explain suffering, and maintain the status quo. Consider how the story functions as a moral framework. In every version, the flood comes as punishment for wrongdoing. Humanity has become corrupt, violent, or disobedient, and divine justice demands cleansing. The message is clear. Step outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and catastrophic consequences will follow. This creates what anthropologists call a myth of return, the idea that disasters are not random, but are cosmic corrections that restore proper order. When floods, earthquakes, or plagues strike, leaders can point to the ancient stories and claim that suffering is the result of collective moral failure. The solution, they suggest, is to return to traditional values and structures. Religious authorities have long used flood narratives to reinforce their own positions. They present themselves as interpreters of divine will, the ones who can recognize the signs of coming judgment and guide people back to righteousness. This creates a dependency relationship where communities rely on religious leaders to protect them from cosmic disaster. Political leaders, too, have found flood myths useful. They can position themselves as modern Noahs, chosen to preserve their people through times of crisis. This grants them extraordinary authority to make difficult decisions, to demand sacrifices, and to reshape society according to their vision. The flood story becomes a blueprint for authoritarian leadership disguised as divine mission. The narrative structure of flood myths also serves to explain social inequality. In most versions, only a small number of people are deemed worthy of survival. This creates a model where elite status is not just social privilege, but cosmic necessity. The wealthy and powerful are not just lucky or ruthless. They are the chosen remnant, preserved by divine wisdom for the good of all. This dynamic plays out in countless ways throughout history. During medieval plagues, the church taught that disease was divine punishment for sin, while presenting itself as the path to salvation. During economic collapses, leaders blame moral decay while positioning themselves as the solution. During environmental crises, various groups use flood imagery to support their preferred policies. The flood myth also serves to suppress questioning of authority. If disasters are divine punishment, then the proper response is not to examine systemic failures or challenge leaders, but to submit more completely to existing power structures. Rebellion becomes not just politically dangerous, but cosmically foolish, an invitation to catastrophe. The story creates what psychologists call learned helplessness on a cultural scale. People come to believe that their fate is determined by forces beyond their control, that their role is to submit and hope for mercy rather than to take action to improve their circumstances. This makes populations easier to manage and less likely to challenge existing arrangements. The selection process in flood myths reinforces existing social hierarchies. Noah was chosen not just for his righteousness, but for his obedience to divine authority. He builds the ark exactly as instructed, gathers the animals as commanded, and waits for divine timing. The model survivor is not a rebel or innovator, but a faithful follower of instructions. This pattern appears in flood stories from around the world. Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic is chosen by the gods and told to build his boat in secret. Manu in Hindu tradition is warned by Vishnu and instructed to gather seeds of all life. Deucalion in Greek mythology is saved because of his piety and obedience to Zeus. In each case, survival depends on submission to divine authority. The flood narrative also serves to justify the loss of knowledge and technology. If advanced civilizations were destroyed because of their corruption, then the loss of their achievements becomes not a tragedy, but a blessing. This can be used to discourage scientific inquiry, technological innovation, or social progress by presenting them as potentially dangerous departures from simple, godly living. The myth creates a cyclical view of history where progress is always temporary and potentially dangerous. Civilizations rise, become corrupt, and fall. The wise response is not to try to build lasting institutions or accumulate knowledge, but to focus on maintaining proper relationships with the divine powers that control the cycle. This cyclical understanding can be used to discourage long-term thinking or planning. If all human achievements are temporary, if floods of judgment are inevitable, then why invest in building lasting institutions, preserving knowledge, or working for social justice? Better to focus on personal salvation and submission to existing authorities. The flood myth also serves to explain why the world is not perfect. Evil, suffering, and injustice are not problems to be solved, but remnants of the corruption that necessitated the flood. They are signs that the world is still fallen, still in need of divine intervention. This can be used to discourage efforts at reform or improvement. Yet flood myths also carry within them seeds of hope and renewal. The waters recede, survivors emerge, and life begins again. This creates space for legitimate change and growth, but only within the bounds of the existing moral and social order. The myth allows for renewal while discouraging revolution. Understanding flood stories as control myths does not necessarily invalidate their spiritual or moral value. Many contain genuine wisdom about human nature, social cooperation, and the need for ethical boundaries. But recognizing their social function helps us evaluate their messages more critically and resist their misuse by those who would exploit them for personal or political gain. The power of these stories lies not just in their antiquity or religious authority, but in their psychological resonance. They speak to deep human fears about chaos, abandonment, and death, while offering hope for survival and renewal. This emotional power makes them effective tools for those who understand how to use them, for good or ill. Ancient climate collapse. The Earth remembers. Buried in ice cores and lake sediments, preserved in tree rings and coral reefs, evidence remains of catastrophic climate changes that shook the ancient world. These records tell of floods that make our modern disasters seem like gentle rain. Around 12,900 years ago, the planet experienced what scientists call the Younger Dryas period. In the span of a few decades, temperatures plummeted across the northern hemisphere. Ice sheets that had been retreating suddenly advanced again. Sea levels dropped and then rose dramatically. The stable climate that had existed for thousands of years collapsed almost overnight. This was not a gradual change, but a sudden shift that would have been catastrophic for human populations. Communities that had grown accustomed to predictable weather patterns, reliable water sources, and stable coastlines found their world transformed. The collapse would have forced massive migrations, destroyed established settlements, and created chaos across entire continents. The end of the Younger Dryas was even more dramatic. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures shot up by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in some regions within a single decade. Ice dams that had held back massive lakes suddenly burst, releasing floods of unimaginable scale. The landscape was reshaped in months rather than millennia. Lake Missoula in North America held water equivalent to half of Lake Michigan. When its ice dam failed, it released floods that carved out the Columbia River Gorge and created the channeled Scabelands of Washington state. Similar megafloods occurred across the northern regions of Europe and Asia, each one capable of destroying civilizations. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis suggests that one of these catastrophic floods created the Black Sea itself. Around 7,600 years ago, rising sea levels breached the Bosphorus, allowing Mediterranean waters to pour into what had been a much smaller freshwater lake. The flooding was so rapid and extensive that it would have displaced hundreds of thousands of people living around the lake's shores. This event aligns remarkably well with flood myths from the region. The timeline matches the development of agriculture and early civilizations in Mesopotamia. Survivors fleeing the flooding would have carried memories of their lost homeland, stories that could have evolved into the flood narratives we know today. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the cradle of civilization, have their own history of catastrophic flooding. Archaeological evidence shows that major floods occurred in this region around 2900 BCE, devastating early cities and forcing populations to rebuild repeatedly. The Sumerian king list records a great flood that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. These floods were not like the seasonal inundations that brought fertile soil to riverbanks. They were walls of water that appeared without warning, carrying away everything in their path. Houses, temples, entire cities vanished beneath the torrent. Only those who reached high ground or had boats ready could hope to survive. The Mediterranean basin experienced its own catastrophic changes. Around 5.96 million years ago, the Strait of Gibraltar was sealed, causing the Mediterranean to dry up almost completely. When the barrier was breached, the resulting flood was one of the largest in Earth's history. While this predates human civilization, it demonstrates the scale of flooding that is possible in the region. Meltwater pulse events throughout the post-glacial period created sudden rises in sea level that would have been catastrophic for coastal populations. During these events, sea levels could rise several meters in a matter of decades, submerging vast areas of inhabitable land. Communities that had thrived for generations would have found themselves underwater with little warning. The Sahara Desert provides another example of dramatic climate change. Around 8,000 years ago, this region was a green savanna with lakes, rivers, and abundant wildlife. Rock art from the period shows people fishing in waters that are now dry sand. The transformation from garden to desert was gradual but relentless, forcing populations to migrate to the Nile Valley and other water sources. Volcanic eruptions added to the climate chaos. The Locher Sea eruption in Germany around 12,900 years ago covered vast areas of Europe with ash and pumice. The Toba supervolcano eruption, while much earlier, created a volcanic winter that lasted for years. Such events would have been remembered as times when the sky itself seemed to fall. Comet impacts may have contributed to some of these catastrophic changes. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that a comet or asteroid impact triggered the climate reversal that marked the beginning of that period. While still debated, evidence includes impact materials, widespread fires, and the sudden extinction of large mammals across North America. These climate catastrophes help explain why flood myths are so widespread and remarkably similar across cultures. They preserve memories of real events that were traumatic enough to shape human consciousness for millennia. The stories of divine punishment and global cleansing may be cultural interpretations of natural disasters that were beyond the ability of ancient peoples to understand scientifically. The patterns of these ancient floods also explain certain features common to flood myths: the sudden onset, the overwhelming scale, the survival of only small groups, the need to rebuild civilization from scratch. All of these elements appear in both the geological record and the mythological accounts. The timing of these climate catastrophes also aligns with the development of agriculture and permanent settlements. As humans began to build more complex societies, they became more vulnerable to climate disruption. A nomadic group could move to avoid disaster, but farmers and city dwellers were tied to their land and infrastructure. The psychological impact of these events cannot be understated. Imagine watching your entire world disappear beneath rising waters. The trauma would be passed down through generations, encoded in stories that served both as historical record and warning for the future. The flood myths are not just tales of divine judgment, but preserved memories of humanity's most vulnerable moments. Modern climate research has revealed the speed and scale of these ancient changes. What once seemed like gradual geological processes we now understand happened in human lifetimes. The flood stories, rather than being primitive superstitions, may be remarkably accurate accounts of real catastrophes that shaped the course of human civilization. The Sumerian reset. After the waters receded, something strange happened in ancient Mesopotamia. Civilization returned, but it was different, smaller, more fragmented. The great unity of the antediluvian world had been broken, replaced by competing city-states that viewed each other with suspicion and fear. The Sumerian king list tells this story in its own cryptic way. Before the flood, it records, kings ruled for thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years. Alangar held power for 36,000 years. These impossibly long lifespans suggest either symbolic meaning or memories of a very different kind of existence. Then comes the flood. The flood swept over, the text states simply. After this brief mention of catastrophe, the list continues, but everything has changed. Post-flood kings rule for decades, not millennia. Their achievements are measured in years, not epochs. The godlike figures of the past have been replaced by mortal rulers struggling with very human problems. This dramatic shift reflects more than just a change in record-keeping. It suggests a fundamental transformation in human nature itself. The connection between heaven and earth, so strong in the antediluvian period, had been severed. Humanity was cut off from the divine realm that had once guided and empowered their ancestors. The cities that arose after the flood were magnificent but troubled. Ur, Uruk, Babylon. Each became a center of learning and power, but also of conflict and rivalry. The knowledge that had once been shared freely among the children of the Watchers was now hoarded, fought over, used as a weapon against neighboring peoples. Kingship itself took on a different character. The Sumerian texts speak of kingship descending from heaven after the flood as if it were a new institution created to fill the void left by the vanished giants. These new rulers claimed divine authority, but they lacked the genuine divine connection that had characterized their predecessors. The first post-flood king mentioned in the list is Jushur of Kish, who ruled for 1,200 years. Still an impressive lifespan by modern standards, but a dramatic reduction from the antediluvian periods. Each successive generation lived shorter lives, as if the divine spark was gradually fading from human bloodlines. The cities competed constantly for dominance, each claiming to be the rightful heir of the pre-flood civilization. Eridu proclaimed itself the first city, the place where kingship originally descended from heaven. Nippur claimed to be the religious center, the earthly residence of Enlil, lord of the air. Uruk boasted of Gilgamesh, the hero king who had achieved immortality through his deeds. But beneath these competing claims lay a shared sense of loss. The Sumerians knew they were living in the shadow of something greater. Their myths spoke constantly of a golden age when gods walked among men, when knowledge flowed freely, when death was not the inevitable end of every human story. This knowledge of decline shaped Sumerian culture in profound ways. They became obsessed with preservation, creating vast libraries to record their wisdom, building monuments designed to last forever, developing writing systems that could capture not just facts, but the essence of their civilization. They were racing against time, trying to prevent another loss of knowledge. The ziggurats that dominated their cities were more than temples. They were attempts to rebuild the connection between heaven and earth. These massive stepped pyramids reached toward the sky, each level bringing the priests and kings closer to the divine realm. But they were pale imitations of the mountains where the Watchers had once descended. Religious practices in post-flood Mesopotamia reflected this desperate attempt to reconnect with lost divine knowledge. Priests performed elaborate rituals designed to attract the attention of distant gods. They studied the movements of stars, hoping to decode messages from heaven. They offered sacrifices, seeking to appease divine powers that seemed increasingly remote and unpredictable. The epic literature of the period is filled with quests for immortality and lost wisdom. Gilgamesh travels to the ends of the earth seeking the secret of eternal life. Atana flies to heaven on the back of an eagle, trying to obtain the plant of birth. Adapa gains wisdom but loses immortality through a trick of the gods. Each story reflects the same theme: humanity's desperate attempt to recover what was lost in the flood. Magic and divination flourished as people sought alternative ways to access supernatural knowledge. If direct communication with the gods was no longer possible, perhaps their will could be discerned through omens, dreams, and ritual practices. The Mesopotamians developed elaborate systems of astrology, hepatoscopy, and dream interpretation, all designed to bridge the gap between human and divine knowledge. The legal codes that emerged in this period reflect the new reality. Hammurabi's code and similar documents were attempts to create order in a world where divine guidance was no longer directly available. These laws were practical, detailed, and harsh, very different from the simple moral principles that supposedly governed the antediluvian world. Trade and warfare became the primary ways cities interacted with each other. Without the unifying knowledge and authority of the pre-flood period, cooperation gave way to competition. Cities that might once have shared resources and information now fought over them. The unity of the antediluvian world had been replaced by a fractured landscape of rival powers. Yet, even in this diminished state, Mesopotamian civilization achieved remarkable things. They invented writing, developed mathematics, created literature, established legal systems, and built cities that remained centers of learning for thousands of years. They proved that even a civilization in decline could accomplish wonders. The memory of the flood and what it had cost them never faded. Generation after generation, Mesopotamian scribes recorded the old stories, preserved the ancient wisdom, and dreamed of a time when the connection between heaven and earth might be restored. They lived in the ruins of a greater civilization, but they refused to forget what had been lost. Babel and the scattered cities. The tower rose from the plain like a mountain built by human hands. Brick upon brick, level upon level, its peak lost in the clouds. The people who built it shared a single language, a single purpose, and a dangerous dream. They would build their way back to heaven. Genesis tells us their words with chilling simplicity. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. This was humanity's first great construction project after the flood. The survivors had multiplied, their numbers growing steadily as they spread across the earth. But instead of dispersing as God had commanded, they gathered together in the land of Shinar, determined to create something that would ensure their unity and power. The site they chose was perfect for their purposes. The plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers offered rich soil, abundant water, and easy access to trade routes. Here they could build not just a city, but a capital, a center from which their influence could spread across the known world. They had learned new technologies since the flood, the art of making bricks from clay and bitumen, stronger and more uniform than the rough stones their ancestors had used. The techniques of large-scale construction, organizing thousands of workers toward a single goal. The principles of engineering that could support structures of unprecedented height. But this was more than just a construction project. The tower was their attempt to reverse the verdict of the flood. If God had scattered humanity by destroying their cities, they would rebuild on a scale that could not be ignored. If the antediluvian world had been swept away because its inhabitants had forgotten their place, they would build a monument that proclaimed their presence to the heavens themselves. The phrase, make a name for ourselves, carries deeper meaning in Hebrew. It suggests not just fame, but identity, legacy, the kind of immortality that comes from being remembered. They were trying to ensure that their civilization would never again be forgotten, never again be vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic loss that had erased their predecessors. The tower itself was probably a ziggurat, a stepped pyramid like those found throughout Mesopotamia. But this would have been the greatest of them all, a structure so massive that its completion would have required the cooperation of the entire human race. It was to be humanity's collective masterpiece, proof of what they could accomplish when they worked together. Each level of the tower would have brought them closer to the heavens. The priests and builders who climbed its steps were literally rising above the earth, approaching the realm where God dwelt. In their minds, they were not rebelling against divine authority, but seeking to join it, to claim their place among the powers that ruled the universe. But God saw their work and was troubled. If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. The unity that made the tower possible also made it dangerous. With a single language and shared purpose, humanity had become too powerful, too ambitious, too likely to repeat the mistakes that had led to the flood. The solution was elegant and devastating. Rather than destroying the tower with fire or earthquake, God simply confused their language. Suddenly, the workers could no longer understand each other. The carefully coordinated construction project collapsed into chaos as groups of people found themselves unable to communicate with their neighbors. The confusion was more than linguistic. Different groups began to see the world in fundamentally different ways. Their priorities shifted, their values diverged, their very concepts of reality began to differ. What had been a unified human race became dozens of distinct peoples, each with its own culture, beliefs, and way of understanding existence. Unable to continue their great work, the people scattered across the earth. They took with them fragments of the knowledge that had made the tower possible, but the unified vision was lost. Instead of one great city, humanity would build many smaller ones, each reflecting the particular genius and limitations of its builders. This scattering explains the distribution of similar technologies and beliefs across the ancient world. The people who left Babel carried with them memories of advanced construction techniques, astronomical knowledge, and religious practices. But these memories were incomplete, filtered through the lens of their new languages and cultures. The ziggurat form appears throughout Mesopotamia, but also in modified versions across the globe. Stepped pyramids in Mexico, temple mounds in North America, terraced structures in Southeast Asia, all might be echoes of the original tower, built by peoples who remembered the concept but had lost the specific knowledge needed to recreate it perfectly. The myths and legends of scattered peoples often preserve memories of this original unity. Stories of a time when all humanity spoke the same language, when great works were possible through cooperation, when the connection between earth and heaven was strong. These tales served as both historical memory and explanation for the diversity they saw around them. The name Babel itself means confusion, but it may also be related to Babylon, the city that later rose in the same region. Babylon claimed to be the heir of Babel, the legitimate successor to the original human capital. Its rulers styled themselves as universal monarchs, seeking to reunite the scattered peoples under their rule. The Tower of Babel story serves as a bridge between the flood narrative and the later history of human civilization. It explains how humanity went from the united antediluvian world to the fractured landscape of competing nations and cultures. It shows how divine intervention shaped not just the physical world, but the very structure of human society. The confusion of languages was both punishment and protection. By making large-scale cooperation more difficult, it prevented humanity from again reaching the dangerous heights that had necessitated the flood. But it also ensured that no single group could dominate all others, preserving diversity and limiting the potential for universal tyranny. The scattered cities that arose after Babel each carried a piece of the original vision. They built their own towers, developed their own technologies, created their own systems of meaning. But they were fragments of what might have been, partial reflections of the unity that had been lost. Yet the dream of reunion never died. Throughout history, empires would rise, claiming to restore the universal kingdom, to reunite the scattered children of Babel under a single rule. Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, and countless others would dream of creating a new Tower of Babel, a civilization that could once again reach toward the heavens. The story reminds us that human ambition is both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. The same drive that enables us to build cities and reach for the stars can also lead us to forget our limitations, to challenge forces beyond our understanding. The tower fell not because it was too high, but because its builders had forgotten wisdom in their pursuit of power. Echoes in Egypt. The Nile flowed backward. For 7 years, its waters failed to rise as they should, bringing famine instead of fertility to the Black Land. The pharaoh dreamed of 7 lean cattle devouring 7 fat ones, of 7 withered ears of grain consuming 7 plump ones. Joseph interpreted these dreams as warnings of abundance followed by scarcity, a cycle that would test the kingdom's wisdom and endurance. Egypt's relationship with water was different from that of other ancient peoples. While Mesopotamians feared the unpredictable floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, Egyptians depended on the regular inundation of the Nile. Their civilization was built around this annual miracle, the predictable rising of waters that brought life to the desert. But Egyptian texts also preserve memories of more catastrophic floods, times when the river rose too high or failed to rise at all. The Turin King list mentions a period when the land was in the hands of chiefs, suggesting political chaos that might have followed climatic disaster. The admonitions of Ipuwer describe a time when the river of Egypt is empty, when the natural order collapsed and society fell into ruin. The Egyptian flood myth centers on the god Osiris, who was murdered by his brother Set, dismembered and scattered across the kingdom. His wife Isis gathered the pieces and restored him to life, but Osiris thereafter ruled the underworld rather than the earth. This story parallels flood narratives from other cultures, with death and resurrection, the scattering of the divine, and the establishment of a new order. The pyramid texts, among the oldest religious writings in the world, contain references to primordial waters called Nun, from which all creation emerged. These waters were not chaotic or destructive like the floodwaters of other myths, but the source of all life and order. Yet even these beneficial waters could become dangerous when they overflowed their proper boundaries. Egyptian cosmology was remarkably sophisticated, incorporating ideas that seemed to anticipate modern scientific understanding. They believed in multiple creations and destructions, cycles of time that stretched across millions of years. The phoenix, which burned itself to death and rose from its own ashes, became their symbol for these cosmic cycles of destruction and renewal. The god Thoth, portrayed as an ibis or baboon, was credited with preserving knowledge through these cyclical destructions. He was the recorder of truth, the inventor of writing, the keeper of divine wisdom. Egyptian priests claimed that their temples contained libraries where Thoth's knowledge was preserved from previous world ages, making Egypt a repository of antediluvian wisdom. Greek philosophers like Plato and Solon traveled to Egypt seeking ancient knowledge. Egyptian priests told them stories of civilizations that existed thousands of years before their own, of islands that had vanished beneath the sea, of knowledge that had been lost and partially recovered. These conversations may have been the source of Plato's Atlantis story. The Egyptian calendar was based on careful observation of stellar cycles, particularly the rising of Sirius, which coincided with the Nile's annual flood. This astronomical knowledge was remarkably precise, suggesting either long periods of careful observation or inheritance of knowledge from earlier civilizations. Some scholars argue that the precision of Egyptian astronomy points to antediluvian origins. The construction of the pyramids demonstrates engineering knowledge that seems almost impossibly advanced for the supposed level of Egyptian technology. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encode mathematical constants like pi and phi, with precision that wouldn't be achieved again until modern times. The alignment with stellar positions suggests knowledge of precession cycles that take thousands of years to observe. Egyptian medicine preserved treatments and surgical techniques that seem surprisingly sophisticated. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes brain surgery procedures that weren't matched in Europe until the Renaissance. The Ebers Papyrus contains remedies for conditions that wouldn't be understood scientifically until the development of germ theory. This medical knowledge might represent fragments of more advanced understanding preserved from earlier periods. The process of mummification itself suggests beliefs about death and preservation that go beyond simple burial customs. The Egyptians believed that proper preservation of the body was necessary for resurrection, that death was a temporary state that could be overcome through proper knowledge and technique. This parallels stories from flood myths about survivors who cheated death through divine intervention or special knowledge. Egyptian art consistently shows contact between humans and beings of supernatural size and power. Wall paintings depict gods who tower over mortal figures, creatures with the heads of animals and bodies of humans, scenes of divine beings interacting directly with earthly rulers. These images might preserve memories of the time when the children of the Watchers walked among humanity. The Egyptian priesthood claimed to maintain traditions that stretched back to the time of the gods, when divine beings ruled directly over humanity. They spoke of the Zep Tepi, the first time when the gods established civilization along the Nile. This golden age supposedly ended when the gods withdrew from direct involvement in human affairs, leaving only their knowledge and blessings behind. The worship of animal-headed deities in Egypt has puzzled scholars for centuries. These strange combinations of human and animal characteristics might represent memories of the hybrid beings described in flood mythology, the offspring of divine and human parents who possessed traits of both species. Egyptian magic was based on the belief that words and symbols possessed inherent power, that reality could be shaped through proper knowledge and technique. The Book of the Dead contains spells for navigating the underworld, transforming into various creatures, and achieving immortality. This approach to magic suggests familiarity with forces and principles that transcend normal physical laws. The decline of Egyptian civilization coincides with the loss of much of this ancient knowledge. Later dynasties could no longer build pyramids on the scale of the early ones, could no longer read the oldest hieroglyphic texts, could no longer perform the magical practices described in ancient papyri. It was as if the connection to their source of wisdom was gradually fading, leaving them with impressive but incomplete fragments of what their ancestors had known. Yet Egypt's influence on later civilizations was profound. Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, Christian theology, and Islamic scholarship all drew from Egyptian sources. The knowledge preserved in Egyptian temples and libraries, even in fragmentary form, continued to shape human understanding long after the civilization that created it had fallen into decay. The echoes of Egypt's flood-connected wisdom continue to resonate today. Modern researchers studying the pyramids continue to discover new mathematical and astronomical relationships encoded in their structure. The search for hidden chambers and lost libraries continues, driven by the belief that Egypt may still hold keys to understanding our forgotten past. India's Manu and the fish long before Noah built his ark, ancient India spoke of waters that covered the world. In the sacred text called the Puranas, a story unfolds that feels both familiar and strange. A man named Manu walks to a river at dawn. He cups water in his hands for morning prayers. A tiny fish swims in his palms. "Save me," the fish whispers. "I will save you in return." Manu places the small creature in a jar. Overnight, it grows too large. He moves it to a pond. Still it grows. A lake cannot hold it. Even the ocean barely contains this fish that speaks like a god. The fish reveals its true nature. It is Vishnu, the preserver, wearing scales instead of skin. "A great flood comes," the fish warns. "Build a boat. Gather the seeds of all life. When the waters rise, I will pull you to safety." This is the Matsya Purana, the fish incarnation story, written centuries before the Bible reached India's shores. The parallels to Noah's tale run deep. One righteous man, divine warning, a vessel to save life. But India's version carries different wisdom. Manu's flood is not punishment. It is renewal. The world dies and is reborn in endless cycles. Cosmic time moves like a great wheel. Each age ends in dissolution. Each new age begins with Manu's descendants. The Vedic texts, older still, speak of these cycles. They call them kalpas and yugas. Vast periods where civilizations rise and fall like waves. The flood is just one turning of the wheel, not God's anger, but time's natural rhythm. In the Shatapatha Brahmana, Manu's story grows more detailed. The flood lasts years. All mountains disappear beneath the waters. Only Manu's boat remains, tied to the fish's horn. When the waters recede, Manu performs a sacrifice. From the offering, a woman emerges. Together, they repopulate the earth. The Hindu flood myths spread far beyond India. They travel with traders and monks. Buddhist texts carry similar stories. The Jataka tales speak of floods that wash away kingdoms. Each story teaches that attachment to the material world brings suffering. What strikes scholars is how these Indian texts handle the flood's purpose. No wrathful deity destroys the world in anger. Instead, creation and destruction dance together. The flood is cosmic breathing. The universe inhales and worlds dissolve. It exhales and life begins again. Some Indian texts describe multiple floods. The Bhagavata Purana speaks of different Manus for different ages. Each cosmic cycle has its own flood, its own savior. Time is not linear but circular. Every ending is a beginning waiting to happen. The fish that saves Manu is enormous. Ancient texts describe it as larger than whales. Its horn stretches for miles. This detail puzzles scholars. Why a horn? Some suggest it represents the cosmic pillar that supports creation. Others see it as a symbol of divine power piercing through chaos. Modern Hindus still celebrate Manu's story. During monsoon season, festivals honor the fish avatar. Devotees wade into rivers, offering prayers for protection from floods. The ancient myth lives on in ritual and belief. But the Vedic flood story offers something unique. It suggests that knowledge survives every deluge. Sacred texts, preserved in memory, pass from one age to the next. The flood destroys bodies and cities, but wisdom endures. Each new civilization rediscovers the same truths. This idea of cyclical destruction and renewal appears throughout Hindu thought. The god Shiva dances the cosmos to death, then dances it back to life. Brahma creates, Vishnu preserves, Shiva destroys. The pattern repeats forever. The flood is just one movement in this eternal dance. Indian flood myths also appear in regional traditions. Tamil literature speaks of the sea swallowing ancient kingdoms. Bengali stories tell of rivers that rise and claim entire cities. Each region adds its own flavor to the universal theme. The Mahabharata, India's great epic, contains flood stories within stories. Heroes face rising waters. Wise men prophesy deluge. The epic suggests that floods come when dharma or righteous duty breaks down. When people forget their place in the cosmic order, nature restores balance through water. Unlike the biblical flood, India's deluge myths offer hope through repetition. This is not the only world nor the last. When the waters come, they wash away the old to make room for the new. Death becomes transformation. Ending becomes beginning. The fish that saves Manu represents more than divine intervention. It embodies the life force that refuses to die. Even in the depths of cosmic dissolution, the spark of existence endures. The fish swims through the flood of time itself, carrying the seeds of tomorrow. These ancient Indian stories spread across Asia. They influence flood myths in Southeast Asia, Tibet, and China. The fish becomes a dragon, Manu becomes different heroes, but the core message remains: life finds a way through the waters of change. Today, as climate change brings new floods, these old stories offer perspective. They remind us that civilizations have faced the waters before. The earth has known many floods, many renewals. We are not the first to watch the waters rise, nor will we be the last. The fish still swims in the cosmic ocean. The boat still waits for those who hear the warning. In the gentle rhythm of the ancient texts, we find comfort. The flood may come, but so does the morning after. The world ends, but the world begins again. The Americas, remember, across the vast Americas, from the Arctic to the southern tip of Chile, native peoples kept alive their memories of the great waters. These stories, passed down through countless generations, speak of floods that covered the earth. Each tribe tells the tale in their own way, but the thread remains unbroken. The Hopi people of the Southwest describe 3 previous worlds, each destroyed by water. In the first world, people lived in harmony with the earth, but they grew selfish and forgot their purpose. The Creator sent floods to cleanse the world. Only the righteous survived, guided by Spider Grandmother to the next world. This pattern repeats. The second world also falls to human corruption. Again, water washes away the old. The third world meets the same fate. Now we live in the fourth world, and the Hopi watch for signs that the cycle might begin again. Their prophecies speak of a time when the waters will return, not from rain or rivers, but from the melting of the great ice. They say the earth will purify itself once more when humanity loses its way. The flood becomes both warning and promise of renewal. In the Amazon rainforest, the Kayapo people tell of Bep Kororoti, a sky being who warned of coming floods. He taught them to build boats and gather seeds. When the waters rose, only those who listened survived. The story lives on in their ceremonies, where dancers wear masks representing the flood spirits. The Inca of Peru spoke of Viracocha, the creator god who emerged from Lake Titicaca. Their myths tell of a world destroyed by flood, with only 2 people surviving on a floating island. From them, the Inca lineage began. The lake itself was seen as a remnant of the great waters that once covered the earth. Maya texts, including the Popol Vuh, describe multiple creations and destructions. The gods tried several times to create humanity. Each attempt failed, ending in catastrophe. One destruction came through resin and tar falling from the sky, another through flood. The water rose until it covered the mountains. Only a few survived to begin again. The Aztecs told of 5 suns, 5 ages of the world. Each son ended in disaster. The fourth son, called Nahui Adal, ended in flood. The water god Tlaloc sent rains that lasted for years. People transformed into fish to survive. When the waters receded, the few remaining humans began the fifth son, our current age. North of Mexico, the Ojibwe people speak of Nanabosho, a cultural hero who survived the Great Flood. He floated on a log with various animals. When the waters began to recede, he sent animals to dive deep and bring up mud. From this mud, he recreated the land. The story teaches that cooperation between humans and animals ensures survival. The Cherokee Nation tells of a time when the world was covered with water. Only the animals lived then, crowded together in the sky. They sent water beetle to dive down and bring up soft mud. This mud spread and became the earth. The story connects the flood to creation itself, showing how destruction and birth intertwine. In the far north, Inuit stories speak of Sedna, the sea goddess who controls the waters. When humans break taboos or treat animals badly, she releases floods to punish them. Shamans must journey to her underwater realm to calm her anger. The flood becomes a tool of cosmic justice, maintaining balance between humans and nature. The Lakota people remember Unktehi, the water monster who brought the Great Flood. Only Crow survived, carrying a ball of mud in his beak. From this mud, the earth was recreated. The story emphasizes that even from total destruction, new life can emerge. The flood is not an ending, but a transition. Pacific Northwest tribes, including the Makah and Quinault, tell of a time when the ocean rose and covered the land. Some people tied their canoes to the tops of mountains, others transformed into whales and sea creatures. When the waters fell, they changed back into humans. The boundary between human and animal becomes fluid during the flood. The Blackfoot Nation speaks of Napi Old Man, who warned people of the coming flood. He told them to build rafts and gather food. Those who listened survived. Those who ignored him perished. The story emphasizes the importance of wisdom and preparation. The flood rewards those who pay attention to the signs. In South America, the Guarani people tell of Tupa, the thunder god who sent floods to punish the wicked. But he also saved the good, teaching them to build boats and preserve seeds. After the flood, Tupa helped them rebuild their world. The destruction becomes an act of love, clearing space for something better. The Mapuche of Chile remember the battle between the serpent Kai Kai and the serpent Tren Tren. Kai Kai controlled the waters and sent floods to destroy humanity. Tren Tren controlled the land and lifted mountains to save people. The flood becomes a cosmic struggle between opposing forces. These American flood stories share common themes. They speak of moral corruption leading to divine punishment. They tell of righteous survivors who preserve the seeds of new life. They emphasize the connection between human behavior and natural disasters. The flood serves as both consequence and opportunity. What makes these stories remarkable is their independence from Old World flood myths. Most were recorded before European contact, yet they echo themes found in Mesopotamia, India, and other ancient civilizations. This suggests either a common human experience or a shared memory of actual events. The variety of flood stories across the Americas reflects the continent's diversity. Desert peoples speak of flash floods. Coastal tribes remember tsunamis. Mountain dwellers tell of glacial floods. Each environment shapes its own version of the universal theme. Many of these stories connect the flood to the end of the last ice age. Scientific evidence shows that massive floods occurred as glaciers melted. Indigenous memories may preserve actual events from over 10,000 years ago. The stories become both myth and history, spiritual teaching and scientific record. Today, as climate change brings new floods to the Americas, these ancient stories gain new relevance. They remind us that the earth has known many floods, many renewals. Indigenous peoples have always understood that water brings both destruction and life. The flood is not an enemy, but a teacher, showing us the consequences of our choices. The wisdom of these stories lies not in their details, but in their perspective. They teach that humans are part of nature, not separate from it. When we forget this truth, the waters rise to remind us. The flood becomes a call to remember our place in the web of life. The Ark as Stargate. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world sleeps and mysteries whisper, we find ourselves drawn to a different understanding of Noah's Ark. What if the vessel that saved humanity was not merely a boat? What if it served as something far more profound, a bridge between worlds, a cosmic doorway, a repository of knowledge that transcends time itself? This interpretation emerges from the shadows of esoteric traditions. Ancient texts hint at secrets hidden within the familiar story. The ark becomes more than wood and pitch. It transforms into a vessel of consciousness, a library of cosmic wisdom, a portal between dimensions. Consider the ark's precise measurements given by God to Noah: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. These numbers carry weight beyond mere construction. Sacred geometry flows through every dimension. The proportions mirror ancient temples, mystical structures designed to connect earth and heaven. The golden ratio appears in the ark's design. This mathematical constant governs the spirals of galaxies and the growth of flowers. It suggests that the ark was built according to universal principles, harmonizing with the very fabric of creation. The vessel resonates with the cosmos itself. Esoteric traditions speak of the ark as a Merkabah, a divine chariot. The Hebrew word suggests movement, a spinning vehicle that carries consciousness between realms. Ezekiel's vision of wheels within wheels echoes this concept. The ark becomes a craft for traversing not just floodwaters, but the oceans of existence itself. Some texts describe the ark as containing more than animals and food. It held the accumulated wisdom of the antediluvian world, the knowledge of the Watchers, the secrets of the Nephilim, the technologies of the first civilization, all preserved within its wooden walls. The ark becomes a cosmic library safeguarding humanity's true heritage. The Zohar, Judaism's mystical text, suggests that the ark existed before creation. It floated in the primordial waters, carrying the blueprints of reality. When the flood came, it simply returned to its original state. The ark becomes eternal, a constant presence in the cosmic ocean. Gnostic traditions interpret the ark as a symbol of the soul's journey. The flood represents the chaos of material existence. The ark is consciousness rising above the waters of confusion. Noah becomes every seeker who builds a vessel of wisdom to navigate the storms of life. The animals in the ark take on new meaning in this interpretation. They represent the archetypal forms, the Platonic ideals that underlie all creation. The ark preserves not just biological species, but the essential patterns of existence. When the new world emerges, these patterns provide the templates for renewed creation. Medieval Islamic texts speak of the ark as a ship of light. It glows with divine radiance, visible from great distances. The light serves as a beacon for those who seek truth. The ark becomes a lighthouse in the ocean of being, guiding souls through the darkness of ignorance. Hindu scriptures describe Vishnu's fish avatar pulling Manu's boat with a cosmic rope. The rope represents the silver cord that connects the soul to higher realms. The boat becomes a vehicle for spiritual ascension, rising through the waters of consciousness to reach divine awareness. Some modern interpretations suggest the ark was a technological marvel. Its creators possessed knowledge that we are only beginning to rediscover. The vessel contained genetic material, compressed into forms we cannot yet understand. The ark becomes a seed bank for the next phase of human evolution. The number of species in the ark presents practical challenges that disappear in this mystical interpretation. If the ark contained archetypal forms rather than physical animals, space becomes irrelevant. A single seed contains the entire tree. A single pattern contains infinite variations. The dove that Noah releases takes on profound symbolism. It represents the soul's reconnaissance mission, exploring the new world of consciousness. When it returns with an olive branch, it brings news of peace between heaven and earth. The dove becomes a messenger of successful transformation. The rainbow that appears after the flood serves as more than a promise. It represents the bridge between dimensions, the covenant between the physical and spiritual realms. The ark has successfully carried humanity across the cosmic divide. The rainbow becomes a sign of interdimensional peace. Ancient astronaut theorists propose that the ark was an extraterrestrial vessel. Its builders possessed technology far beyond our current understanding. The flood represents a quarantine period, isolating Earth while genetic experimentation takes place. The ark becomes a laboratory for human evolution. Kabbalistic traditions describe the ark as containing the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation. This text holds the formulas for manifesting reality. The ark preserves the fundamental codes of existence. When the new world begins, these codes provide the programming for cosmic renewal. The Ark's three levels mirror the three worlds of mystical tradition. The lower level represents the material realm. The middle level symbolizes the emotional and mental planes. The upper level connects to the spiritual dimensions. The Ark becomes a complete cosmology in miniature. Some texts suggest that the Ark never truly landed. It continues to float in the cosmic ocean, available to those who achieve the proper state of consciousness. The Ark becomes a permanent refuge, a sanctuary that exists outside of time and space. The 40 days and nights of rain carry deep significance. 40 represents transformation, the period required for fundamental change. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. Jesus fasted for 40 days. The Ark's journey becomes a mystical initiation, a passage through the trials of transformation. The sending forth of the raven, which does not return, represents the shadow aspects of consciousness. These must be released before the new world can emerge. The raven becomes a sacrificial offering, carrying away the darkness of the old age. In this understanding, the Ark exists within each of us. We are all builders of vessels, gathering the pairs of opposites within our consciousness. The flood is the chaos of modern life. The Ark is our practice, our discipline, our commitment to preserving wisdom in the midst of confusion. The Ark as Stargate offers hope for our current age. If the vessel truly transcends time and space, it remains available to guide us through our own floods of change. The cosmic library awaits our discovery. The dimensional doorway stands ready for our passage. This interpretation does not diminish the Ark's reality. Instead, it reveals layers of meaning that enrich our understanding. The physical vessel carries spiritual cargo. The historical event reflects cosmic principles. The ancient story speaks to eternal truths. In the quiet of contemplation, we sense the Ark's presence. It floats just beyond the horizon of ordinary consciousness, waiting for those who are ready to board. The Stargate stands open. The cosmic library calls to us. The vessel that saved humanity continues its eternal journey, carrying us home to the stars. Where did they go? When the waters receded and the earth dried, questions lingered in the silence. Where did the survivors of the Great Flood go? The familiar story tells us about Noah and his family, but whispers in ancient texts suggest others may have survived. Hidden communities, secret lineages, and forgotten civilizations that escaped the rising waters. These survivors, according to various traditions, did not simply disappear into history. They went underground, both literally and figuratively. Some texts speak of vast cavern systems where the wise ones took refuge. Others describe floating cities that rode out the storm on the cosmic sea. Still others tell of those who ascended to higher dimensions, watching from realms beyond our sight. The Book of Enoch hints at this mystery. It tells of the watchers who were punished for their transgressions, but also speaks of those who remained faithful. These loyal beings, along with their human allies, may have found sanctuary in hidden places. The text suggests that knowledge was preserved in secret vaults, waiting for the proper time to emerge. Underground cities discovered around the world fuel these speculations. Derinku in Turkey, Petra in Jordan, the vast tunnels beneath the Sahara. These places could have sheltered survivors. The engineering required to create such spaces suggests advanced knowledge. Perhaps the builders possessed wisdom from before the flood. Some traditions speak of the Shambhala, a hidden kingdom that exists beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. This mystical realm, said to be located in the Himalayas, preserves the pure teachings of the ancient world. Its inhabitants are described as the guardians of wisdom, the keepers of sacred knowledge. They emerge periodically to guide humanity through difficult transitions. The Hopi prophecies mention the blue star Kachina, beings who will return when the world faces its greatest challenges. These entities are described as the survivors of previous worlds, the ones who escaped the floods and destructions of earlier ages. They watch from their hidden realm, waiting for the moment to reveal themselves. In South America, legends speak of the Viracocha, the foam-born ones who emerged from Lake Titicaca after the Great Flood. These beings taught civilization to the survivors, then disappeared into the landscape. Some say they went underground, creating vast tunnel systems that connect sacred sites across the continent. Others believe they ascended to the stars, becoming the constellation patterns that guide human destiny. The Celtic traditions tell of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, who retreated to the otherworld when their time on Earth ended. They became the fairy folk, the hidden ones who live in parallel to human civilization. These beings are described as the survivors of an ancient flood, the keepers of the old ways who went underground to preserve their culture. Norse mythology speaks of survivors who escaped Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. They hide in the wood called Hudmimus Holt, sustaining themselves on morning dew. When the world is reborn, they emerge to repopulate the earth. The pattern repeats. Survivors go into hiding, then return when the time is right. Modern conspiracy theories build on these ancient foundations. They speak of underground civilizations, secret societies, and hidden technologies. The survivors of the flood in these accounts became the puppet masters of history. They work from the shadows, guiding human development towards some unknown goal. The hollow earth theory suggests that the survivors went inward, into vast spaces beneath the Earth's crust. Admiral Byrd's supposed journal describes encountering advanced beings during his polar expeditions. These entities claim to be the descendants of the antediluvian civilization, the ones who escaped the surface catastrophe. Some interpretations suggest that the survivors ascended to a higher dimension. They exist in the same space as us, but on a different vibrational frequency. Occasionally, they manifest in our reality as angels, guides, or mysterious helpers. They watch over humanity, intervening when necessary to prevent total destruction. The Gnostic texts speak of the archons, beings who survived the cosmic flood by hiding in the lower dimensions. They became the rulers of the material world, trapping human souls in endless cycles of reincarnation. The survivors, in this view, are not benevolent guardians, but cosmic parasites feeding on human energy. Aboriginal Australian traditions tell of the dreamed ancestors who went underground when the world changed. They became the rainbow serpents, the guardians of water and wisdom, who live in the deep pools and underground rivers. They emerge in times of drought or flood, reminding humans of their connection to the land. The Tibetan traditions speak of the masters of wisdom, advanced beings who live in hidden monasteries high in the mountains. These entities are said to be the survivors of Lemuria and Atlantis, the ones who escaped the global catastrophes of the distant past. They preserve the ancient knowledge, revealing it slowly to those who are ready. Some theories suggest that the survivors left Earth entirely. They became the star people, the ancient astronauts who watch over human development from their space-based civilization. UFO encounters, in this interpretation, represent visits from our own descendants, checking on the progress of those who remain behind. The Mesoamerican traditions tell of Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, the feathered serpents who departed over the eastern sea. They promised to return when the world was ready for their wisdom. The survivors, in this view, became the navigators of the cosmic ocean, sailing between worlds on ships of light. Secret societies throughout history claim descent from these flood survivors. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, all trace their origins to those who preserve the ancient wisdom. They work to guide human civilization toward enlightenment, though their methods remain hidden from ordinary view. The survivors may have gone into the future as well as into hiding. Time travelers who escaped the temporal destruction of the flood, they exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. They appear as prophets, teachers, and guides, helping humanity navigate the challenges of each age. Some traditions suggest that the survivors became the guardians of specific bloodlines. Royal families, priestly castes, and mystical lineages all claim descent from the pre-flood civilization. The survivors work through these bloodlines, maintaining their genetic and spiritual heritage across the millennia. The survivors may have fragmented into multiple groups, each taking a different path to preservation. Some went underground, others to the stars, still others into parallel dimensions. They maintain contact through subtle means, coordinating their efforts to guide human evolution. As we face our own potential floods, whether literal or metaphorical, these ancient stories offer both warning and hope. They suggest that wisdom survives even the greatest catastrophes. Somewhere in hidden places or elevated states, the knowledge waits. The survivors watch, ready to emerge when the time is right. Perhaps the survivors never left at all. Perhaps they became the dreams that inspire us, the intuitions that guide us, the love that connects us. The flood may have ended, but the journey continues. The survivors live on in every act of compassion, every moment of wisdom, every choice to preserve rather than destroy. The question of where they went becomes a question of where we are going. Will we join the survivors in their hidden realm? Will we become the guardians of wisdom for future generations? The waters may rise again, but the ark of consciousness sails on, carrying all who choose to board. The flood's moral question. In the depth of night, when conscience whispers and the heart grows heavy, we must ask the question that haunts every telling of the flood. Was this justice, or was this too much? The traditional answer comes swift and certain. God saw wickedness and acted to cleanse the world. But in the quiet moments between faith and doubt, the question returns like water finding its level. The book of Genesis tells us that God looked upon the earth and saw that the wickedness of man was great. Every imagination of human hearts was only evil continually. The text paints a picture of total moral collapse. Murder, violence, and corruption filled the earth. In this reading, the flood becomes necessary surgery, removing the cancer to save the patient. Yet the scale troubles the thoughtful mind. All flesh had corrupted its way. Every person except one family deserved death. This includes infants who had never spoken a word, children who had never chosen evil, the mentally disabled who could not understand right from wrong. The flood's justice becomes collective punishment of the most absolute kind. Ancient commentators struggled with this question. The Talmud suggests that even the animals had become corrupted, breeding outside their kinds, violating the natural order. If all creation had fallen into chaos, perhaps only complete renewal could restore balance. The flood becomes cosmic chemotherapy, destroying healthy cells to eliminate the disease. The Midrash tells of Rabbi Akiva weeping as he taught the flood story. His students asked why he mourned over the wicked who deserved punishment. He replied that he wept not for the wicked, but for the divine sorrow that necessitated such destruction. Even God, in this reading, takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. The Zohar offers a different perspective. It suggests that the flood was not punishment, but transformation. The waters were actually divine light, purifying rather than destroying. The souls of the drowned were not annihilated, but refined, prepared for reincarnation in a cleaner world. Death becomes graduation to a higher level of existence. Augustine wrestled with the flood's morality in his Confessions. He concluded that all humans deserve death because of original sin. The flood simply enacted the justice that every person merits. God's mercy is not in preventing death, but in delaying it. The flood victims received what they deserved. Noah's family received unmerited grace. Modern theologians take different approaches. Some embrace the text's moral framework completely. Humans had free will, chose evil, and faced consequences. Others see the story as mythological, expressing truths about divine justice without requiring literal acceptance of universal execution. Process theology suggests that God suffers with creation, experiencing the pain of every death. The flood becomes not divine wrath, but cosmic tragedy. God feels the weight of every life lost, every child drowned, every innocent swept away. The deity emerges from the flood as wounded as the survivors. The question of divine omniscience complicates the moral calculation. If God knew from the beginning that creation would become corrupt, why proceed with creation? If the fall was inevitable, does punishment become unjust? The flood forces us to consider whether omniscience and perfect justice can coexist. Some traditions suggest that God offered humanity many chances to repent. Enoch preached for centuries. Methuselah's long life gave additional time for repentance. Noah spent decades building the ark in full view, providing a visible warning. The flood comes only after exhaustive divine patience. The Quran presents a different version of the flood story. Noah preaches for 950 years, begging his people to turn from their evil ways. He builds the ark with their mockery ringing in his ears. When the flood comes, it strikes only the community that rejected his message. The global becomes local, the universal becomes particular. Hindu concepts of karma offer another lens. The flood victims may have deserved their fate based on actions in previous lives. What appears unjust in the present becomes cosmic justice across multiple incarnations. The children who die may be paying debts from previous existences, their deaths serving as payment for ancient crimes. Buddhist thought emphasizes the interconnectedness of all beings. Individual karma combines with collective karma to create the conditions for disasters. The flood results not from divine anger, but from the accumulated weight of harmful actions. Suffering becomes a teacher, pointing toward the need for compassion and right action. Native American traditions often see natural disasters as the Earth's immune response. When humans live out of balance with nature, the Earth takes corrective action. The flood becomes not punishment, but healing, the planet's attempt to restore equilibrium. Moral responsibility shifts from individual sin to collective environmental impact. The possibility of innocent victims raises profound questions about the nature of justice itself. If the flood killed those who had never done wrong, can it be called just? Traditional answers invoke the mystery of divine wisdom, suggesting that human understanding cannot fathom the complexities of cosmic justice. Some interpreters suggest that no one was truly innocent. The corruption was so complete that even the children had been tainted by their environment. They were victims of their society, but they were also carriers of its corruption. The flood prevents the cycle of violence from continuing to future generations. The psychological impact of the flood story shapes how we understand divine justice. Children who learn the story may develop fear of an unpredictable God who destroys the world when displeased. Others find comfort in a deity who will not allow evil to triumph indefinitely. The same story produces both fear and hope. Modern genocide studies examine the flood narrative as a prototype for ethnic cleansing. The complete destruction of all but one family group resembles the logic of genocide, the elimination of a corrupted population to make room for a pure one. This reading makes the flood story deeply disturbing to contemporary readers. Environmental interpretations see the flood as a warning about ecological collapse. Human corruption led to the destruction of the natural world. The flood becomes a preview of climate change, a reminder that the earth has limits. The moral question shifts from divine justice to human responsibility for environmental stewardship. The flood's aftermath provides some comfort. God's rainbow covenant promises that such complete destruction will never come again. The deity appears to have learned from the experience, choosing different methods for dealing with human wickedness. The flood becomes a unique event, not a pattern for future judgments. Yet the rainbow covenant raises its own questions. If the flood was perfectly just, why promise never to repeat it? Does the covenant suggest that God recognized the moral problems with universal destruction? The rainbow becomes either a promise of mercy or an admission of past excess. The question of whether the flood was justice or vengeance cannot be answered definitively. It depends on our understanding of divine nature, human nature, and the relationship between them. The story forces us to grapple with fundamental questions about good and evil, innocence and guilt, mercy and justice. Perhaps the flood's true purpose is to raise these questions rather than answer them. The story becomes a moral laboratory, a place where we can explore the boundaries of justice and mercy. It challenges our assumptions about what God should do and how the world should work. In the end, the flood's moral question reflects our own moral struggles. How do we balance justice and mercy in our own lives? When is punishment appropriate and when does it become excessive? The ancient waters mirror our contemporary dilemmas about crime and punishment, war and peace, individual rights and collective responsibility. The flood may have ended, but the moral questions it raises continue to flow through human consciousness. They challenge us to think deeply about justice, to wrestle with the complexities of right and wrong, to seek balance between the demands of conscience and the needs of the heart. The waters recede, but the questions remain as eternal as the rainbow that spans the sky, rebuilding in silence. After the waters fell and the earth dried, an extraordinary thing happened. The world began again, but not as it had been before. The survivors stepped onto ground that had been washed clean, ground that held no memory of the cities and civilizations that had flourished there. They began to rebuild, but something had changed. The old knowledge was gone, and the new world rose in strange silence. Noah and his family were not the master builders who had created the wonders of the antediluvian world. They were survivors, not architects of the old civilization. The skills that had raised the magnificent cities were not passed down to them. The flood had not only destroyed the buildings, but had severed the chain of knowledge that connected one generation to the next. Archaeological evidence suggests this pattern in many locations around the world. Sophisticated building techniques appear suddenly in the historical record, flourish for a time, then disappear just as mysteriously. The builders seem to have taken their secrets with them, leaving behind monuments that later generations could not reproduce. Consider the precision of the pyramids, the massive stones of Baalbek, the intricate tunnels of Cappadocia. These achievements suggest knowledge that was later lost. The people who came after could admire these structures, but could not explain how they were built. The rebuilding world had to rediscover these techniques slowly through trial and error. The silence extends beyond construction methods. Languages also seem to have been forgotten and relearned. The complexity of ancient scripts like Linear A, the sophistication of Sumerian cuneiform, the mathematical precision of Mayan hieroglyphs all suggest that the art of writing was once more advanced than we typically assume. The flood may have disrupted the continuity of written tradition. Oral traditions, which we might expect to preserve important knowledge, also show signs of disruption. The stories that survive are often garbled, filled with gaps and inconsistencies. Details that would have been crucial for practical application are missing. It's as if the storytellers remembered the outlines but lost the specifics. This forgetting may not have been entirely accidental. Some traditions suggest that the survivors chose to forget certain things. The knowledge that had led to the corruption of the pre-flood world was deliberately abandoned. The arts of war, the techniques of oppression, the methods of environmental destruction, these were left to die with the old world. The Book of Enoch describes how the Watchers taught humanity forbidden knowledge. Metallurgy, astronomy, cosmetics, weapons, all these arts are portrayed as corrupting influences. If this interpretation is correct, the post-flood world may have deliberately started fresh, avoiding the dangerous knowledge that had brought destruction. This selective forgetting appears in many recovery stories. After traumatic events, societies sometimes choose to abandon certain practices or technologies. The survivors focus on what they need for basic survival, leaving behind the complexities that may have contributed to their downfall. Agriculture provides an interesting case study. The post-flood world had to rediscover farming, but not from complete ignorance. The survivors carried seeds with them, suggesting some knowledge of plant cultivation. Yet the early agricultural practices show signs of experimentation and gradual development, as if the full science of farming had to be relearned. Astronomy offers another example. The ancient world shows sophisticated knowledge of celestial movements, yet this knowledge appears to have been lost and rediscovered multiple times. The builders of Stonehenge understood solar and lunar cycles, but the people who came after them had to rebuild this understanding from observation and calculation. The development of writing systems also suggests this pattern of loss and recovery. Cuneiform, hieroglyphs, and alphabetic scripts all appear to have been invented multiple times in different places. Each culture seems to have developed writing independently, as if the idea had to be rediscovered rather than transmitted. Metalworking shows similar discontinuities. Bronze Age techniques are lost, then rediscovered. Ironworking appears, disappears, then returns. The smiths of each age seem to have learned their craft anew, without benefit of the accumulated knowledge of their predecessors. Even basic technologies like the wheel show strange patterns of development. The wheel appears early in some cultures, then disappears from the archaeological record, only to reappear centuries later. The knowledge seems to have been forgotten and rediscovered, as if each generation had to solve the problem afresh. This pattern suggests that the post-flood rebuilding was not a simple process of gradual development. Instead, it involved multiple cycles of discovery, loss, and rediscovery. Knowledge was fragile, easily lost when the people who possessed it died or when social structures collapsed. The silence of the rebuilding years may also reflect a conscious choice to live differently. The flood had demonstrated the dangers of certain kinds of knowledge and power. The survivors may have decided to build a simpler world, one that would not attract divine wrath or natural catastrophe. Religious practices from the early post-flood period show this restraint. The elaborate temple complexes and ritual systems of later civilizations are absent from the earliest archaeological layers. Instead, we find simple altars, basic offerings, and uncomplicated ceremonies. The survivors seem to have approached the divine with humility and caution. Trade networks also show this pattern of gradual development. The extensive trade routes of the pre-flood world, if they existed, were not immediately recreated. Instead, commerce developed slowly, starting with local exchanges and gradually expanding over larger distances. The knowledge of navigation, currency, and trade protocols had to be rebuilt from scratch. Political structures show similar restraint. The early post-flood communities appear to have been small and egalitarian, without the complex hierarchies and centralized authority of later civilizations. The survivors may have chosen simpler forms of organization, avoiding the concentrations of power that had led to corruption. The development of cities follows this pattern. The earliest post-flood settlements are small and unpretentious, nothing like the magnificent cities described in flood myths. The arts of urban planning, architecture, and civil engineering had to be rediscovered gradually through generations of trial and error. This rebuilding in silence may explain why flood myths are so widespread yet so vague about practical details. The stories preserve the memory of the disaster, but not the specific knowledge that had existed before it. The survivors pass down warnings and moral lessons, but not technical instructions or historical facts. The silence also extends to the flood itself. While the memory of the disaster survived, the specific details of its cause and mechanism were lost. Was it rain, tsunami, glacial melt, or cosmic impact? The survivors remembered the water, but not its source. The knowledge of what had triggered the catastrophe disappeared with those who witnessed it. This forgetting may have been protective. Detailed knowledge of the flood's cause might have led to attempts to prevent future disasters, which could have required dangerous technologies or forbidden practices. The survivors may have chosen ignorance as a form of safety, avoiding the knowledge that had brought destruction. The archaeological record supports this interpretation. The earliest post-flood layers show simple technologies and basic lifestyles. Complexity increases gradually over time, as if each generation had to rediscover the arts of civilization. The knowledge was not transmitted but recreated through human ingenuity and divine inspiration. Languages also show this pattern of simplification and gradual development. The earliest post-flood languages appear to be simpler than their descendants, with smaller vocabularies and less complex grammar. The sophistication of language had to be rebuilt through use and evolution, not inherited from the past. Mathematical knowledge follows the same pattern. The complex calculations required for astronomy, architecture, and engineering had to be rediscovered. The survivors may have retained basic counting and simple arithmetic, but the advanced mathematics of the pre-flood world was lost and had to be reconstructed. The rebuilding in silence explains many puzzles in human history. Why do civilizations seem to start from scratch? Why is there so little continuity between ancient and modern knowledge? Why do the same discoveries appear to be made repeatedly in different places and times? The answer may be that the flood created a fundamental break in human development. The survivors had to rebuild not just their cities and farms, but their entire knowledge base. They chose to do so carefully, in silence, avoiding the mistakes that had brought destruction to their predecessors. This rebuilding continues today. Each generation faces the choice of what knowledge to preserve and what to abandon. We rediscover ancient wisdom, lose it again, then find it once more. The silence of the rebuilding years echoes in our own struggles to understand the past and shape the future. The flood may have ended, but the rebuilding continues. We are still emerging from the silence, still recovering the knowledge that was lost, still learning to live wisely in a world that has known destruction. The waters have receded, but the work of rebuilding goes on, generation by generation, in the patient silence of human hope. The second floods, long after Noah's waters receded, other floods rose to claim their place in human memory. These later deluges, scattered across time and geography, carried echoes of the first great flood. They reminded scattered peoples that water remained a divine messenger, a force that could reshape the world in an instant. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived when Zeus flooded the earth to punish human wickedness. Like Noah, they received divine warning. Like Noah, they built a vessel and rode out the storm. When the waters fell, they threw stones over their shoulders, and the stones became people. The flood myth lived on, adapted to new gods and new circumstances. This second flood shared themes with the first, but carried Greek sensibilities. Zeus was angry not at general corruption, but at specific acts of violence and betrayal. The flood was more targeted, more personal. It demonstrated divine justice rather than cosmic renewal. The survivors repopulated the earth not through biological reproduction, but through magical transformation. The Roman poet Ovid wove these flood stories into his Metamorphoses, creating a literary tradition that would influence European thought for centuries. In his telling, the flood becomes a moment of transformation where the old world dies and a new one is born. The waters wash away not just people, but entire ways of being. Regional floods throughout history have been interpreted through this lens of divine judgment and renewal. The Black Sea deluge around 5600 BCE may have inspired flood myths across the ancient world. As the Mediterranean broke through to fill the Black Sea basin, entire civilizations were displaced. The survivors carried their flood stories to new lands, adapting them to local conditions. The Nile's annual floods provided Egypt with a different model. These waters brought life rather than death, fertility rather than destruction. The Egyptians developed flood myths that celebrated the life-giving power of water. Osiris, god of the underworld, was associated with the Nile's floods. His death and resurrection mirrored the annual cycle of flood and drought. The Indus Valley civilization, one of the earliest urban cultures, was shaped by flood cycles. The Harappan cities show evidence of repeated flooding and rebuilding. The people adapted to the water's rhythm, building drainage systems and elevated structures. When the civilization finally collapsed, climate change and altered flood patterns may have played a role. China's long history is punctuated by great floods that reshaped the landscape and influenced dynastic changes. The Yellow River, known as China's Sorrow, has changed course multiple times throughout history. Each change brought flooding that could kill millions and displace entire populations. Chinese flood myths often feature heroes who control the waters through engineering and moral virtue. The legendary Yu the Great represents this tradition. He tamed the floods not through divine intervention, but through human effort and virtue. Yu dredged channels, built dikes, and redirected rivers. His success in controlling the waters legitimized his rule and founded a dynasty. The flood becomes a test of leadership rather than a divine punishment. Medieval Europe experienced its own significant floods, often interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. The Great Flood of 1342 affected much of Central Europe, killing thousands and destroying crops. Contemporary chroniclers saw it as punishment for moral corruption and social disorder. The flood became a call to repentance and reform. The Netherlands has fought a centuries-long battle against floodwaters. The Great Storm Surge of 1953 killed over 1,800 people and demonstrated the ongoing power of water to reshape human life. The Dutch response was not to abandon their low-lying land, but to build better defenses. They transformed their relationship with water from fear to partnership. The Johnstown flood of 1889 in Pennsylvania created a distinctly American flood mythology. The disaster was caused not by natural forces alone, but by human negligence and class conflict. A poorly maintained dam burst, sending a wall of water toward the industrial city below. The flood became a symbol of the dangers of industrial capitalism and social inequality. Hurricane Katrina and the flooding of New Orleans in 2005 revealed similar themes. The disaster exposed long-standing problems of race, class, and environmental justice. The flood became a mirror reflecting America's unresolved social tensions. Like the ancient floods, it prompted questions about justice, responsibility, and renewal. These modern floods carry forward ancient patterns. They displace populations, destroy established orders, and create opportunities for social change. The survivors must decide what to preserve and what to abandon as they rebuild. The flood becomes a moment of choice, a chance to create something new from the ruins of the old. Climate change has brought new floods and new interpretations of flood mythology, Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities around the world. Extreme weather events produce sudden floods that overwhelm urban drainage systems. Uh, these modern floods are interpreted not as divine punishment, but as consequences of human actions on the environment. The response to these modern floods often echoes ancient patterns. Some communities choose to retreat, abandoning flood prone areas and starting fresh elsewhere. Others choose to adapt, building higher seawalls and better drainage systems. Still others choose to accept the flood as part of the natural cycle, learning to live with periodic inundation. Indigenous communities often maintain flood traditions that reach back to ancient times. They understand floods as part of natural cycles that must be respected rather than conquered. Their flood stories teach adaptation rather than resistance, harmony rather than domination. The Maasai of East Africa maintain flood myths that connect local floods to cosmic events. When the rains fail or come too heavily, the disruption is understood as a sign of imbalance in the relationship between humans and nature. The floods become teachers, showing how to live more sustainably. Australian Aboriginal cultures have flood stories that stretch back thousands of years. These stories often explain the formation of specific geographic features, connecting local floods to the activities of ancestral beings. The floods become part of the landscape's spiritual biography, events that continue to influence the land and its people. Pacific Island cultures face rising sea levels that threaten their very existence. Their flood stories take on new urgency as they consider whether to abandon their ancestral lands or fight to preserve them. The ancient myths provide both comfort and guidance as communities face unprecedented challenges. The second floods remind us that the first flood was not a unique event, but part of an ongoing pattern. Water continues to rise and fall, to destroy and create, to challenge and teach. Each flood carries forward the memory of all previous floods, adding new chapters to the story of humanity's relationship with water. These floods also demonstrate the adaptability of flood mythology. The same basic story can be adapted to different cultures, different circumstances, and different understandings of divine power. The flood becomes a universal human experience, one that transcends specific religious or cultural boundaries. The pattern of flood, destruction, and renewal appears to be hardwired into human consciousness. We expect floods to carry moral meaning, Spiegelbefreitung, to serve as opportunities for judgment and transformation. When floods come, we automatically look for lessons, for signs of what went wrong, and how to do better. The second floods also show that the relationship between humans and water is still evolving. Each flood teaches new lessons about engineering, social organization, and environmental stewardship. The survivors of each flood must decide how to incorporate these lessons into their rebuilding efforts. As we face the prospect of more floods in an era of climate change, these ancient patterns provide both warning and hope. They remind us that floods have always been part of human experience, that societies have survived and adapted to water's power. They also show that floods can be opportunities for positive change, chances to build better and more sustainable communities. The second floods continue to flow through human history, carrying forward the memory of the first great deluge, while adding their own unique contributions to the stream of human experience. They remind us that the story of the flood is not finished, that new chapters are still being written in the eternal dance between water and human civilization. Cities beneath the sea, deep beneath the waves, where sunlight never reaches and pressure crushes the unprepared, lie the ruins of what once was. The ocean floor holds secrets that challenge our understanding of human history. These underwater cities, scattered across the globe, whisper of civilizations that thrived before the great floods changed everything. Off the coast of India, in the waters near Dwarka, divers have discovered what appears to be an ancient city. Massive stone blocks arranged in clear patterns suggest sophisticated construction techniques. The local traditions speak of Krishna's city, a magnificent settlement that was swallowed by the sea. The ruins match the descriptions in ancient texts, raising questions about the historical accuracy of myths we once dismissed as fantasy. The underwater structures show signs of planned construction. Streets run in orderly patterns. Building foundations follow consistent architectural principles. The stonework displays a level of skill that suggests advanced knowledge of engineering and construction. These are not random collections of rocks, but the remains of a genuine urban center. Carbon dating of artifacts recovered from the site suggests the city was inhabited over 9,000 years ago. This places it in the period immediately following the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were rising dramatically. The city may have been built on dry land, then submerged as the oceans claimed their new boundaries. Similar discoveries have been made in other parts of the world. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument presents a puzzle that has divided experts. The massive underwater structure features stepped pyramids, carved channels, and what appear to be roads and buildings. Some researchers argue it's a natural formation, while others see clear evidence of human construction. The Yonaguni Monument shows signs of both natural and artificial elements. The basic rock formation may be natural, but the modifications appear to be the work of human hands. Channels have been carved to direct water flow. Steps have been cut into the rock face. The monument may represent a hybrid of natural landscape and human architecture. If the Yonaguni Monument is artificial, it predates the rise of known Japanese civilizations by thousands of years. The builders would have possessed sophisticated knowledge of stone carving and architectural planning. The monument suggests that advanced civilizations existed in the Pacific long before the historical record begins. The Mediterranean Sea has yielded its own underwater cities. Off the coast of Alexandria, divers have discovered the remains of ancient ports and palaces. These structures were built above sea level, but later submerged by earthquakes and rising waters. The ruins include massive columns, carved statues, and sophisticated harbor works. The Alexandrian discoveries provide a clear example of how geological changes can swallow entire cities. The ancient harbor works, now underwater, show the sophistication of ancient engineering. The builders understood tides, currents, and wave action. They created structures that could withstand the ocean's power, at least until the earth itself shifted beneath them. In the Black Sea, researchers have found evidence of settlements that were flooded when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus. The Black Sea deluge, around 5600 BCE, may have inspired flood myths across the ancient world. The rising waters would have displaced entire populations, forcing them to carry their flood stories to new lands. The Black Sea discoveries suggest that the area was once fertile farmland, dotted with settlements and crossed by rivers. When the deluge came, it happened quickly, giving the inhabitants little time to evacuate. The preserved remains show evidence of rapid abandonment, as if the people had to flee immediately when the waters rose. The Caribbean has produced its own underwater mysteries. The Bimini Road, a linear arrangement of stones beneath the waters near the Bahamas, has sparked debate about its origins. Some see it as a natural formation, while others argue it's the remains of an ancient road or harbor. The stones are arranged too regularly to be entirely natural, but they may represent a combination of natural and human elements. The Pacific Ocean holds perhaps the greatest secrets. The vast expanses of water may conceal entire continents worth of submerged land. The ancient maps that show large landmasses in the Pacific may not be fantasies, but memories of real places that were claimed by the sea. Lemuria, the hypothetical lost continent, was proposed by scientists to explain the distribution of certain fossils and geological formations. While the scientific basis for Lemuria has been disproven, the idea persists in various forms. The Pacific may indeed hold the ruins of advanced civilizations, even if they're not continent-sized. The ocean's role as a preserver of ancient remains cannot be overstated. Underwater sites are protected from the weathering and human interference that destroy land-based ruins. The cold, dark depths act as a natural refrigerator, preserving organic materials that would have decayed long ago on land. Underwater archaeology has revealed that our ancestors were more sophisticated than previously thought. They built cities, developed complex cultures, and possessed advanced technologies. The flood myths may preserve memories of these lost civilizations, passed down through generations of survivors. The submerged cities also demonstrate the power of natural forces to reshape human history. A single event, an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, a rapid rise in sea level, could destroy civilizations that had taken centuries to build. The survivors would have to start over, carrying only their memories and the knowledge they could preserve. The distribution of underwater ruins suggests that coastal civilizations were once common around the world. These societies would have been vulnerable to rising sea levels, tsunamis, and other water-related disasters. The flood myths may represent a collective memory of these repeated disasters. Modern technology has made it possible to explore these underwater ruins in unprecedented detail. Sonar mapping reveals the extent of submerged structures. Underwater cameras capture images of ancient architecture. Remotely operated vehicles can explore depths that are too dangerous for human divers. The discoveries are accelerating as technology improves. Each new expedition reveals more underwater ruins, more evidence of ancient civilizations. The ocean is giving up its secrets, one discovery at a time. The cities beneath the sea are finally ready to tell their stories. These underwater discoveries force us to reconsider our understanding of human history. The civilizations that built these cities were not primitive. They possessed advanced knowledge of construction, engineering, and urban planning. They created beautiful architecture and sophisticated infrastructure. The cities beneath the sea also remind us of our vulnerability to natural disasters. The builders of these underwater ruins probably thought their cities would last forever. They invested enormous effort in creating permanent structures, yet the sea claimed them all, demonstrating that no human achievement is truly permanent. The exploration of underwater ruins is just beginning. The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and most of it remains unexplored. The cities we have discovered may represent only a small fraction of what lies beneath the waves. The sea may hold the remains of civilizations that dwarf anything we have found on land. The cities beneath the sea offer hope, as well as warning. They show that human creativity and ingenuity have always found ways to flourish, even in the face of natural disasters. The builders of these underwater cities created beautiful and functional urban environments. Their legacy lives on in the ruins that rest on the ocean floor. As we face our own challenges with rising sea levels and climate change, the cities beneath the sea serve as both inspiration and warning. They remind us that civilizations can be lost to natural forces, but they also demonstrate that human creativity and resilience can create magnificent achievements. The cities that now rest beneath the waves once buzzed with life, hope, and human dreams. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but it is beginning to share them with those who have the courage to dive deep and the wisdom to listen. The cities beneath the sea are calling to us across the depths of time, telling us stories of triumph and tragedy, of human achievement and natural power. Their voices carry across the centuries, whispering of worlds that were lost and worlds that might yet be found. What the Bible left out. In the shadows of the canonical text, hidden in fragments and forgotten scrolls, lie the stories that were deemed too dangerous, too mysterious, or too challenging for the common believer. These are the texts that the Bible left out, the apocryphal writings, the pseudepigraphic books, and the oral traditions that once shaped understanding of the Great Flood and the world that perished beneath its waters. The Book of Enoch stands as perhaps the most significant of these excluded texts. This ancient work, attributed to the seventh patriarch from Adam, provides a detailed account of the Watchers, the fallen angels who descended to earth and corrupted humanity. The book describes their forbidden teachings, their giant offspring, and the divine judgment that followed. Yet, despite its popularity in ancient times, Enoch was excluded from the biblical canon, leaving a gap in the flood narrative that has haunted scholars for centuries. Enoch's account of the Watchers provides crucial context for understanding why the flood was necessary. According to the text, these angels taught humanity metallurgy, astronomy, warfare, and cosmetics. They revealed secrets of heaven that were meant to remain hidden. Their offspring, the Nephilim, became mighty warriors who terrorized the earth. The flood was not just punishment for human sin, but a response to cosmic rebellion. The book describes the world before the flood in vivid detail. Cities of unprecedented size and beauty covered the earth. Technologies that we can barely imagine were commonplace. The Watchers and their descendants created a civilization of wonders, but also of terrible corruption. The price of their knowledge was the soul of humanity itself. The first book of Enoch includes the Book of the Watchers, which tells of Enoch's journeys through the heavens. He witnesses the judgment of the fallen angels and learns the secrets of creation. The book provides a cosmology that explains the structure of the universe and humanity's place within it. This knowledge was considered too dangerous for ordinary believers, leading to the book's exclusion from the biblical canon. The Jubilees, another apocryphal text, provides a different perspective on the flood narrative. It presents a detailed chronology of events from creation to the flood, filling in gaps left by the biblical account. The book describes the gradual corruption of humanity and the patient attempts of the righteous to warn of coming judgment. It portrays the flood as the culmination of a long process of moral decay. Jubilees also provides details about the post-flood world that are absent from the biblical account. It describes how Noah's descendants divided the earth among themselves and how different nations arose from the flood survivors. The book suggests that the flood did not entirely eliminate the corruption of the pre-flood world, as some of the Watchers' knowledge survived in hidden form. The Testament of Noah, a fragmentary text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserves Noah's own account of the flood. The patriarch describes his preparations for the deluge and his experiences during the long months on the ark. The text provides practical details about the construction of the vessel and the care of the animals that are missing from the biblical account. The Slavonic Enoch, also known as Second Enoch, contains additional flood narratives that were excluded from the canonical text. It describes Enoch's ascension to heaven and his transformation into the archangel Metatron. The book suggests that Enoch became the divine scribe, recording the deeds of humanity and the decisions of the heavenly court. This exalted view of Enoch was too controversial for inclusion in the biblical canon. The Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi present a radically different interpretation of the flood story. In these accounts, the flood is not sent by the supreme god, but by the demiurge, a lesser deity who seeks to destroy humanity out of jealousy and fear. The true God, working through the serpent in Eden and other agents, tries to preserve humanity and its potential for spiritual enlightenment. The hypostasis of the archons and the Apocryphon of John present Noah as an unwitting tool of the demiurge, while the true heroes are those who resist the flood and preserve the spiritual knowledge that the demiurge seeks to destroy. These texts turn the traditional flood narrative on its head, making the survivors into rebels against cosmic tyranny rather than recipients of divine grace. The Mandean texts, preserved by a religious community in Iraq and Iran, contain flood narratives that emphasize the preservation of spiritual knowledge rather than physical survival. These texts describe how the true teachings were hidden in sacred books and preserved by initiates who could read the secret script. The flood becomes a metaphor for the overwhelming ignorance that threatens to destroy spiritual wisdom. The Testament of Levi, part of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, contains visions of the pre-flood world that were excluded from the biblical account. Levi describes the cities of the Watchers and their giant offspring, the technologies they developed, and the corruption they spread. The text suggests that the antediluvian world achieved a level of civilization that has never been equaled. The Book of Giants, known from fragments found at Qumran and in Manichaean texts, tells the story of the Nephilim from their own perspective. These giant offspring of the Watchers are portrayed as complex characters, capable of both great evil and moments of genuine repentance. Some of them receive prophetic dreams warning of the coming flood, but they are unable to prevent their own destruction. The Ethiopic Enoch contains the parables of Enoch, which present the flood as part of a cosmic drama involving the Son of Man, the righteous elect, and the final judgment. These parables influenced early Christian thought about the end times and the second coming of Christ. The flood becomes a prefiguration of the final judgment, when the wicked will be destroyed and the righteous will inherit the earth. The Cairo-Geniza fragments have preserved portions of Hebrew and Aramaic texts that provide additional details about the flood narrative. These fragments suggest that there were multiple versions of the flood story circulating in ancient Jewish communities, each with its own emphasis and interpretation. The canonical account represents only one strand of a much richer tradition. The Samaritan Pentateuch, while not entirely excluded from the biblical tradition, contains variations in the flood narrative that were rejected by mainstream Judaism and Christianity. These variations include different genealogies, altered chronologies, and additional details about the construction of the ark. The differences highlight how fluid the flood tradition was in ancient times. The reason these texts were excluded from the biblical canon varied. Some were considered too speculative, dealing with mysteries that were beyond human understanding. Others were rejected because they contradicted the theological positions of the emerging Orthodox communities. Still others were excluded because they were associated with heretical groups or foreign influences. The process of canonization was gradual and contested. Different communities had different collections of sacred texts, and it took centuries for the current biblical canon to emerge. The flood narrative was particularly controversial because it raised fundamental questions about the nature of God, the problem of evil, and the fate of humanity. The excluded texts were not simply forgotten. They continued to influence Jewish and Christian thought through indirect channels. Medieval theologians studied them in secret. Mystical traditions preserved their teachings. Renaissance scholars rediscovered them and incorporated their insights into new theological systems. The modern rediscovery of these texts has revolutionized our understanding of ancient flood traditions. We now know that the biblical account was part of a vast literature dealing with the Great Deluge. The excluded texts provide context, fill in gaps, and offer alternative interpretations that enrich our understanding of this fundamental human story. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century, have been particularly important in this process of rediscovery. These texts, hidden in caves near Qumran, preserved many of the excluded flood narratives in their original languages. They reveal the diversity of ancient Jewish thought about the flood and its meaning. The question of why these texts were excluded remains relevant today. As we face our own potential floods, whether literal or metaphorical, we must ask what knowledge we are preserving and what we are leaving behind. The excluded texts remind us that there are always multiple ways to understand any event, and that the official version may not be the complete version. The Bible left out much of the flood story, but the excluded texts preserved what was missing. They remind us that the flood narrative is richer and more complex than the canonical account suggests. They challenge us to think more deeply about the meaning of the Great Deluge and its relevance to our own times. The excluded texts continue to speak to us across the centuries, offering alternative perspectives on one of humanity's most enduring stories. They remind us that there are always voices that are silenced, stories that are suppressed, and truths that are hidden. The Bible left out much, but the excluded texts preserved what was lost, waiting for the day when humanity would be ready to hear their testimony. The memory of water. Water remembers everything. It carries the stories of mountains it has worn down, the secrets of valleys it has carved, the echoes of cities it has swallowed. Tonight, as rain taps against windows across the world, we hear those ancient whispers calling back to us. The flood myths aren't just stories. They're humanity's deepest memory encoded in our collective soul. Every culture that ever watched rivers rise or storms rage has told this tale. The details change, but the heart remains the same. Water comes, the world ends, a few survive, life begins again. Why does this story live in every corner of human consciousness? Perhaps because it happened. Not once, but many times. Ice ages melted, seas rose, rivers changed course overnight, coastal cities vanished beneath the waves. Each time, survivors carried forward fragments of what was lost. But there's something more haunting than the physical floods. It's what we've forgotten between the waters. The civilizations that built wonders we can barely imagine, the knowledge that seemed too dangerous to preserve, the connections between earth and sky that our ancestors took for granted. The biblical flood speaks of giants walking the earth, advanced beings who taught forbidden arts. Cities where angels mingled with humans. Then came judgment, washing it all away. What if the flood wasn't just punishment but erasure, a cosmic reset button pressed when things went too far? Think about the survivors in every flood story. They're never random. Noah was chosen for his righteousness. Utnapishtim was warned by a god. Manu was saved by divine fish. Deucalion built his ark on heavenly advice. The survivors carried forward not just life, but memory. Selective memory. What did they choose to remember? Agriculture, writing, basic crafts, the fundamentals of civilization. What did they leave behind? The advanced knowledge, the dangerous technologies, the direct contact with otherworldly beings. Perhaps some memories were too heavy for the new world to bear. Water holds information. Scientists tell us now that water molecules can form complex structures, storing patterns and frequencies. Ancient traditions spoke of water's memory long before modern research. Holy water, sacred springs, rivers that carried blessings and curses downstream. The floodwaters didn't just destroy, they preserved. Beneath lake beds and ocean floors, archaeologists find traces of lost worlds. Cities swallowed whole, their secrets locked in sediment and silence. Each discovery raises new questions about what we thought we knew. Göbekli Tepe emerged from Turkish hills, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids. Its massive stone circles speak of sophisticated astronomy and engineering. Then mysteriously it was buried, deliberately covered with tons of earth, as if someone wanted it forgotten. Was this how knowledge survived the floods? Hidden underground, waiting for safer times? The Younger Dryas period ended abruptly 11,700 years ago. Global temperatures shot up, ice sheets collapsed, sea levels rose hundreds of feet. If advanced civilizations existed before this climate catastrophe, they would have vanished beneath the waves. Only their stories would remain, transforming into myth as centuries passed. Aboriginal Australians tell of times when the sea was much lower. Their stories describe walking to places now submerged, hunting animals in areas now covered by water. These oral traditions span thousands of years, preserving memories of landscapes long lost. How many other flood stories carry similar truths? The Sphinx shows water erosion patterns that suggest it's far older than mainstream archaeology admits. Easter Island statues have bodies buried deep underground. Nan Madol's massive stone blocks were somehow transported across water using techniques we can't replicate. Are these remnants of pre-flood civilizations? Ancient maps show Antarctica without ice, coastlines that match what satellites see today beneath the ice sheets, the Piri Reis map, the Orontius Phineus map. How did ancient cartographers know what lay beneath miles of frozen water? Unless the ice wasn't always there. Perhaps the flood stories aren't about divine judgment. Maybe they're about cycles. Natural disasters that reset human civilization every few thousand years. Ice ages come and go. Asteroids strike. Volcanoes reshape continents. Each time, knowledge is lost. Each time, survivors start over. But something always carries forward. DNA holds memory. Bloodlines preserve ancient wisdom. Secret societies guard forbidden knowledge. The Watchers, whatever they were, left traces in human genetics and human stories. Their influence echoes through ages, surfacing in art, architecture, and myth. Water flows in cycles: evaporation, condensation, precipitation. The same water that fell on Atlantis fills our oceans today. The same molecules that flooded ancient Mesopotamia flow through our bodies. We are made of water, and water remembers. The flood myths serve as warning and promise. Warning that civilizations rise and fall. That knowledge can be lost overnight, that the earth itself can rebel against human excess, but also promise that life continues, that wisdom survives, that each ending births a new beginning. Tonight, somewhere, archaeologists work by lamplight, brushing sand from artifacts that shouldn't exist. Marine biologists discover structures on ocean floors that challenge everything we thought we knew. Indigenous elders share stories their grandparents whispered, keeping ancient memories alive. The next time rain falls, listen closely. Each drop carries the memory of where it's been, the clouds it formed, the rivers it fed, the civilizations it nourished, and the cities it claimed. In the sound of falling water, we hear the echoes of every flood that ever was and ever will be. Water remembers. And perhaps in remembering water, we remember ourselves. Not just who we are, but who we once were, and who we might become again, when the waters finally recede and reveal what lies beneath. The flood stories will endure as long as humans tell tales. They remind us that nothing lasts forever, but everything leaves traces. In stone and story, in the endless memory of water itself, let the rain sing its ancient lullaby. Tomorrow brings new discoveries, new questions, new possibilities, but tonight we rest in the gentle rhythm of water returning to the sea, carrying our dreams along ancient pathways back to the source of all stories.